Hello, weary traveler of the modern world. Wherever you find yourself tonight, perhaps curled beneath warm blankets in a heated room, or listening through earphones as rain patters against your window, I welcome you to this quiet hour we'll share together. It's late now, isn't it? The day's responsibilities have finally released their grip on your mind, and you've carved out this small sanctuary of time for yourself. This moment of peace before sleep claims you. I wonder where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a bustling city where streetlights pierce the darkness outside your window? Perhaps you're in a quiet suburb where the only sounds are the distant hum of traffic and the settling of your house around you. Or maybe you've found yourself in the countryside where darkness falls more completely and the silence feels deeper, more profound. Wherever you are, know that you're not alone in this restless hour. Countless others have sought solace in stories like these, finding comfort in the knowledge that others have endured far greater hardships than any we face today. If you find peace in these words, if this gentle journey into the past helps quiet your mind, I hope you'll return to join me again. Think of this as our quiet corner of the world. A place where history whispers its secrets in the softest of voices, where the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us can lull us into deeper understanding and eventually into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we journey backward through the centuries, to a time when winter was not merely an inconvenience, when it was not simply a matter of adjusting the thermostat or pulling on a heavier coat. We travel to an age when the changing of the seasons brought with it a transformation so complete, so devastating, that entire communities would spend half their year preparing for the other half. We venture into the medieval world, where winter was not just cold, it was a trial by ice and darkness that tested every fiber of human endurance, every bond of community, every spark of hope that kept the human spirit alive. So settle deeper into your comfort, dear listener. Let your breathing slow as we prepare to step across the threshold of time itself, back to an era where survival was never guaranteed, and where the simple act of seeing another spring was cause for profound gratitude. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let the modern world fade around you as we begin our journey into the brutal, beautiful, heartbreaking reality of medieval winters. Picture, if you can, what it meant to be truly powerless against the elements. In our modern age, we speak casually of harsh weather, of particularly cold winters or severe storms. But these are merely temporary inconveniences in lives cushioned by technology, by heating systems that respond to the touch of a button, by grocery stores that remain stocked regardless of the season. We have forgotten, or perhaps we never truly knew what it meant when winter was not just weather, but an enemy more relentless and merciless than any human foe. Why medieval winter was pure agony goes beyond simple cold. It was a season that transformed the very nature of existence, that stripped away the thin veneer of comfort and security that warmer months provided, revealing the raw, desperate business of survival that lay beneath. It was a time when death walked more openly among the living, when families huddled together not just for warmth but for the psychological comfort of human presence in the face of forces that cared nothing for human hopes, human dreams, human love. In those long ago centuries, roughly from 500 to 1500 CE, winter was a season of isolation so complete it bordered on imprisonment. Communities that thrived with relative abundance during harvest time found themselves cut off from the wider world for months at a time, their existence reduced to the contents of their storerooms, the strength of their walls, and the endurance of their spirits. Roads became impassable quagmires of mud and ice. Rivers froze solid, cutting off trade routes and communication. The very air seemed to thicken with malevolence. carrying with it not just cold, but the scent of desperation, the sound of coughing that too often preceded death. Medieval winter was not merely harsh, it was transformative. It changed not just the landscape, but the people themselves, turning vibrant communities into huddled collections of survivors, transforming proud farmers and craftsmen into anxious guardians of dwindling resources. It was a season that revealed the fundamental vulnerability of human life, the thin thread upon which civilization itself hung, dependent on nothing more reliable than the hope that spring would eventually return. This was winter as an existential threat, winter as a test of everything that made life worth living. It was cold that penetrated not just clothing and walls, but the very soul, darkness that lasted so long it seemed eternal, hunger that gnawed at both body and spirit until survival became the only thought, the only prayer, the only dream worth holding. The brutality of medieval winter lay not just in its physical discomfort, but in its psychological weight. It was the season when time slowed to a crawl, when each day was a small victory against forces that seemed determined to prove humanity's ultimate insignificance in the face of natural power. It was winter as teacher, as judge, as the great equalizer that reduced prince and peasant alike to the same fundamental struggle, the desperate daily fight to see another dawn. You wake in the depths of a medieval winter, and immediately you understand that something fundamental has changed in the world around you. The air itself seems different, thicker somehow, more resistant to your lungs, sharp with a cold that bites at your throat with each breath. Your exhale forms clouds of vapor that hang in the air like ghostly reminders of warmth fleeing your body, dissipating slowly in the still air of your chamber. The darkness is complete. No streetlights pierce this medieval night. No electronic displays cast their artificial glow. The only illumination comes from the dying embers of your hearth, their faint orange glow barely sufficient to outline the rough wooden beams above your head, the thick stone walls that seem to absorb what little light exists. This is darkness as our ancestors knew it, not the temporary absence of light that we experience today, but a profound, enveloping presence that transforms the familiar into the foreign, the comfortable into the threatening. You pull your rough, woolen blanket closer, feeling its coarse texture against your skin. Medieval wool was not the soft, refined material we know today. It was crude, heavy, often still carrying the lanolin and smell of the sheep from which it came. It scratched and irritated the skin, but it was warm, more, at least warmer than the alternative of nothing at all. These blankets were precious commodities, often passed down through generations, mended and remended, until they were more patch than original material. The cold creeps through the gaps in your dwelling like a living thing. Medieval construction, even at its finest, was no match for winter's persistence. Chinks between stones allowed drafts to whistle through with mournful voices. Window coverings, often nothing more than oiled cloth or animal hide, provided minimal barrier against the elements. The very walls seemed to conduct cold inward, drawing heat from your body and radiating it away into the night. As you move to stir the fire, your bare feet touch the floor and you gasp involuntarily. The packed earth or rough stone beneath you has absorbed the cold of countless winter nights, becoming a reservoir of frigidity that steals warmth from any living thing that touches it. Medieval floors were often nothing more than beaten earth covered with rushes or straw, materials that provided minimal insulation and often harbored moisture that froze during the coldest nights. The scent of your dwelling tells its own story of medieval winter survival. There is the acrid smell of smoke from fires that burn green wood or whatever combustible material could be found, not the clean smoke of properly seasoned hardwood, but the thick, choking output of desperate fuel choices. Mingled with this is the earthy odor of root vegetables stored in corners, their smell growing stronger as some begin the slow process of decay that winter's length makes inevitable. Beneath these immediate scents lies something more subtle but more troubling. The smell of too many people living in too small a space with too little opportunity for cleanliness. Medieval winter meant confinement, and confinement meant that human odors accumulated and intensified. It was the smell of bodies that could not be properly washed, of clothes that could not be properly cleaned, of waste that could not be properly disposed of when the world outside became too hostile to venture into for anything but the most essential tasks. You move closer to your window and peer through the thick glass or oiled hide that serves as your barrier against the world outside. What you see confirms your deepest fears about the season that has settled upon your world. The landscape that greets your eyes is one transformed beyond recognition. This is not the same world that supported life and community just months before. Fields that once waved with grain now lie hidden beneath snow so deep and unbroken that they might as well not exist at all. The careful boundaries between one holding and another, marked during warmer seasons by stone walls or hedgerows, have vanished beneath winter's equalizing blanket. This is England in the year 1347. Or perhaps France in 1203, or the German territories in 1456. The exact year matters less than the season, for medieval winter was a constant across centuries and regions, a recurring catastrophe that communities faced generation after generation with only marginal improvements in their ability to survive it. You are witnessing a world in the grip of what historians would later call the medieval warm period's end. As climate patterns shifted toward colder, harsher winters that would characterize the later Middle Ages, the village beyond your dwelling appears almost abandoned. Though you know it shelters perhaps 200 or 300 souls. Smoke rises from some chimneys, those fortunate enough to have saved sufficient fuel, but many buildings show no signs of life at all. These are not empty structures, but homes where people have retreated so completely from the outside world that they might as well be hibernating animals, emerging only for the most essential needs. Medieval settlements were not designed for comfort, but for survival, and winter revealed the stark utilitarianism of their construction. Houses huddled together not from any aesthetic choice, but from necessity. Shared walls meant shared warmth, and shared warmth meant survival. The narrow, winding streets that might seem charming in warmer weather now serve as wind tunnels that concentrate and amplify winter's assault, creating corridors of bitter air that can freeze exposed skin in minutes. The great manor house that dominates your view is perhaps the only structure that shows signs of abundant life. Smoke pours from its multiple chimneys, and the thick stone walls that mark it as a dwelling of the wealthy also mark it as one of the few places where winter might be faced with something approaching comfort. But even wealth had its limits in medieval winter. Inside those stone walls, the lord and his family might have more blankets, more food, and more fuel, but they were still prisoners of the season, still dependent on stores laid up during better times, still vulnerable to the diseases and dangers that winter brought to every human dwelling. The fields beyond the village tell their own story of medieval agriculture's vulnerability to seasonal change. What had been carefully tended strips of land, the fundamental economic unit of medieval life, now lay buried and useless. The grain that would sustain the community through winter had been harvested months ago, stored in whatever secure buildings the village could provide. But storage in the medieval world was an imperfect art. Grain spoiled from moisture, was consumed by rats and insects, or simply ran out before spring returned. The forest that borders the village has become both refuge and danger. Its trees provide windbreak and fuel, but they also harbor wild animals made desperate by hunger, and human outlaws for whom winter desperation has overcome social bonds. Medieval winter drove some to brigandage, to taking from others what they could not provide for themselves. The forest's dark interior holds the constant possibility of violence, but also the promise of game for those skilled and fortunate enough to hunt successfully in winter conditions. This landscape is one shaped by a climate that modern science would recognize as fundamentally different from our own. The medieval warm period, which had allowed for agricultural expansion and population growth in the earlier centuries, was giving way to cooler, more variable weather patterns. Winters were becoming longer, colder, and more unpredictable. Growing seasons shortened, reducing the time available for food production. Weather patterns became more extreme, bringing not just cold but destructive storms that could devastate communities in a single night. Understanding this context makes the medieval response to winter not just reasonable but inevitable. Communities that seem to us to have been living in poverty were often communities that had made hard choices about how to allocate limited resources across an entire year. Every extra blanket, every stored apple, every carefully hoarded piece of firewood represented a calculation about survival that we, in our heated and provisioned world, can barely comprehend. The cold you feel in this medieval winter is not the temporary discomfort we know today, quickly remedied by adjusting a thermostat or adding another layer of modern synthetic insulation. This is cold as a physical presence, an entity with weight and substance that presses against you from all directions. It seeps through every barrier that medieval technology could provide, finding gaps in clothing, cracks in walls, moments of inattention when body heat escapes faster than it can be generated. Medieval clothing was the first and most important line of defense against winter's assault. But it was a defense built from materials that we would consider crude and inadequate. The wealthy might own garments made from fine wool, perhaps lined with fur from animals trapped during warmer months. But even these luxurious items were constructed without the benefit of modern understanding about insulation, wind resistance, or moisture management. Medieval clothing was heavy, cumbersome, and often ineffective at maintaining body temperature during the coldest weather. For the common people, winter clothing was an exercise in layering whatever materials were available. A typical peasant might wear a rough linen undergarment, if they were fortunate enough to own one covered by a woolen tunic, topped with whatever outer garments they possessed. These might include a cloak made from animal hide, a hood crafted from scraps of fabric, mittens knitted from yarn spun in the previous year's brief leisure time. But all of these items shared common weaknesses. They absorbed moisture and lost their insulating properties when wet. They were difficult to dry in winter conditions, and they wore out quickly under the stress of constant use. The very concept of staying warm in medieval winter was fundamentally different from our modern understanding. We think of warmth as a steady state that can be maintained through mechanical systems and engineered materials. Medieval people understood warmth as a resource to be carefully conserved and strategically deployed. They knew that body heat was precious and finite, that it could be lost faster than it could be generated, and that maintaining it required constant attention and careful planning. The human body's response to medieval winter was often one of gradual adaptation and slow deterioration. Without adequate nutrition was rare in medieval winter. The body's ability to generate heat diminished over time. People lost weight not just from reduced food intake, but from the enormous caloric demands of maintaining body temperature in constantly cold conditions. This weight loss reduced the body's natural insulation and made individuals even more vulnerable to cold as winter progressed. Medieval people developed strategies for managing cold that seem almost primitive to us, but represented sophisticated understanding of their available resources. They slept together for warmth, with entire families sharing beds or sleeping spaces to cool their body heat. They heated stones by their fires and carried these primitive warming devices to bed, wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. They consumed hot liquids whenever fuel allowed, understanding intuitively that warming the body from inside provided relief that no external warming could match. The architecture of medieval dwellings reflected this constant battle against cold. Rooms were small to conserve heat more effectively. Ceilings were low for the same reason. Windows were tiny and few, their benefit in providing light considered less important than their liability in allowing heat to escape. Doors were constructed with thick wood and fitted as tightly as medieval carpentry could manage, often with heavy curtains hung across them as additional barriers against drafts. Central to every medieval dwelling was the hearth, but maintaining a fire through a medieval winter was an undertaking that consumed enormous resources and constant attention. Fuel, whether wood, charcoal, or in some regions dried dung, had to be gathered during warmer months and carefully rationed throughout winter. A fire that provided adequate warmth for a cold evening might consume fuel that should last several days. The choice between immediate comfort and long-term survival was one that medieval families faced daily throughout the winter months. The smoke from medieval fires was itself a hardship that added to winter's burdens. Without modern chimney technology, most medieval dwellings filled with smoke during cold weather when buildings were sealed against drafts. This smoke burned eyes and throats, made breathing difficult, and coated everything in the dwelling with soot and ash. But the alternative, allowing the fire to die and facing the cold without any heat source, was often worse than enduring the smoke. Even in the wealthy households, where fuel was more abundant and fireplaces more sophisticated, winter cold remained a constant presence. Stone castles and manor houses might have multiple fireplaces, but they also had high ceilings and large spaces that were impossible to heat effectively. The wealthy might be warm when sitting directly beside a fire, but moving away from the hearth meant entering air so cold that breath became visible and fingers quickly lost their flexibility. As winter deepens around your medieval dwelling, a new enemy joins the cold in its assault on human survival: hunger. Not the temporary discomfort of missing a meal that we might experience today, but the slow, grinding awareness that food, the fundamental requirement for maintaining life itself, is becoming scarce, and that scarcity will only worsen as winter continues its relentless advance. Medieval food storage was an imperfect science practiced by people who understood that their lives depended on their success. The harvest months were times of desperate activity, when communities worked from dawn to dusk, not just to gather crops, but to preserve them in ways that might allow them to survive until the next growing season. Grain was stored in whatever dry spaces could be found or constructed, often upper floors of buildings, sealed containers that provided some protection against rodents, or underground cellars that offered consistent cool temperatures. But medieval preservation techniques had severe limitations. Grain, even when properly dried and stored, could develop mold that made it dangerous to eat. Root vegetables stored in cold cellars might survive for months if conditions were perfect. But those same cellars could flood during winter thaws, destroying entire stores. Meat could be preserved through smoking or salting, but these processes required resources that were themselves limited. Salt was expensive, and smoke required fuel that was needed for warmth. The wealthy could afford to store more food and preserve it more effectively. But even they faced the fundamental limitation of medieval agriculture. The growing season was short, and the dormant season was long. A bad harvest affected everyone, though it affected the poor first and most severely. A harsh winter that lasted longer than usual could exhaust the food stores of even well-prepared communities. In your medieval dwelling, you would become intimately familiar with the hierarchy of hunger. The first foods to disappear would be the luxuries that made eating pleasurable rather than merely sustainable. Fresh fruit would be a memory from autumn. Meat would become increasingly rare, reserved for special occasions or for those whose physical labor was essential to community survival. Bread, when grain was available to make it, would become darker and coarser as better grain was. Rationed and inferior materials were ground into flour as supplements. Medieval communities developed strategies for extending their food supplies that required both ingenuity and desperation. They learned to eat parts of animals that more prosperous times would have fed to dogs. They found ways to make thin soups from bones that had already been used multiple times. They discovered which tree barks could be ground into flour substitutes, which roots remained edible even after freezing, which seeds stored from the previous year might still have nutritional value. The psychological impact of hunger in medieval winter was perhaps as devastating as its physical effects. Hunger was not just discomfort, but a constant reminder of vulnerability. It affected sleep, making rest fitful and unsatisfying. It impacted mood, creating irritability and depression that strained social bonds when community cooperation was most essential. It dominated thoughts, making it difficult to focus on anything beyond the immediate need for food and the uncertainty about when that need might be satisfied. Children were particularly vulnerable to winter hunger, their growing bodies requiring nutrition that was increasingly unavailable as winter progressed. Medieval parents faced heartbreaking decisions about how to distribute insufficient food among family members. Do you give more to the children who need it for growth, or to the adults whose labor is essential for the family's survival? Do you share equally and watch everyone slowly weaken, or do you prioritize some family members over others? Medieval winter hunger was also hunger without certainty. Modern food insecurity, devastating as it can be, often exists within systems that provide some safety net, some possibility of assistance. Medieval winter hunger existed in isolation, with no realistic hope of outside help until weather conditions improved enough to allow travel and trade. Communities knew that their stored food was all the food they would have until spring returned, and they had no way of knowing exactly when that spring would arrive. The physical effects of prolonged winter hunger were visible throughout medieval communities. People became thinner, more fragile, more susceptible to illness. Their hair lost its luster, their skin its healthy color. They moved more slowly, conserved their energy for essential tasks, gave up activities that were not directly related to survival. The vibrant social life that might characterize warmer months disappeared as people focused their reduced energy on staying alive until better times returned. Hunger also changed the social dynamics of medieval communities. Food became a source of power and conflict. Those with more food stores gained influence over those with less. Theft of food became one of the most serious crimes a community could face, threatening not just the victim but the social bonds that held the community together during its most vulnerable time. Yet medieval communities also developed remarkable systems of mutual support in the face of winter hunger. Religious institutions provided what assistance they could, though they too faced resource limitations. Families shared with relatives when possible. Neighbors looked after neighbors when sharing meant the difference between survival and death. These networks of mutual aid were often informal and invisible, but they represented sophisticated social technologies for managing scarcity and ensuring that as many people as possible survived until spring's return. In the depths of medieval winter, as cold and hunger weakened bodies and spirits, a third enemy joins the assault on human survival: disease. Medieval winter was prime season for illnesses that could spread rapidly through communities where people were crowded together for warmth, where nutrition was poor, and where conditions for hygiene were minimal. What begins as a simple cough in one dwelling can quickly become a community-wide epidemic that kills more people than cold and hunger combined. The medieval understanding of disease was fundamentally different from our modern knowledge, based more on observation of symptoms than comprehension of causes. They understood that sickness spread from person to person, but they attributed this to bad air, evil humors, or divine punishment rather than the bacteria and viruses that we now know to be responsible. This misunderstanding led to treatments that were often ineffective and sometimes harmful, but it also led to some preventive measures that were surprisingly effective. Respiratory illnesses were the great killers of medieval winter. What we might recognize today as pneumonia, bronchitis, or influenza spread easily in the closed, smoky conditions of winter dwellings. A person who developed a persistent cough might infect their entire household within days. The cough would spread to neighboring houses, to the church during Sunday services, to the manor house when tenants came to fulfill their obligations to their lord. The symptoms of winter illness in the medieval world were terrifying for those who experienced them, and those who watched loved ones suffer. Fever in a cold dwelling was particularly cruel. The body's attempt to fight infection by raising its temperature created misery when external temperatures were already dangerously low. Patients burned with internal heat while shivering uncontrollably from cold, creating suffering that seemed to attack from both directions simultaneously. Medieval treatments for winter illnesses were limited and often reflected desperation more than effectiveness. Herbal remedies might provide some comfort. Teas made from willow bark could reduce fever and pain, though the medieval practitioners who used them did not understand the chemical compounds that made them effective. Bloodletting, one of the most common medieval medical treatments, could actually weaken patients who were already struggling with malnutrition and cold stress. The social impact of winter illness in medieval communities was as devastating as its physical effects. When illness struck a household, it often incapacitated not just one person, but entire families. This meant that essential winter tasks, maintaining fires, preparing what food was available, caring for animals, might go undone precisely when they were most critical. A family that lost its primary adult members to illness might not survive the winter even if they recovered from the disease itself. Medieval winter illness also created impossible moral dilemmas. Should sick people be isolated to prevent the spread of disease, even though isolation might mean death from cold and neglect? Should healthy family members risk infection by caring for sick relatives? How could communities balance the Christian duty to care for the suffering with the practical necessity of protecting the healthy members who were essential for community survival? Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable to medieval winter diseases. Children's immune systems, already stressed by cold and hunger, provided little defense against infections. Elderly people, their bodies weakened by decades of hard living, often succumbed quickly to illnesses that younger adults might survive. The loss of these community members was not just personally devastating, but economically. Catastrophic children represented the future labor force, and elderly people carried essential knowledge about survival techniques and community traditions. The psychological impact of widespread winter illness was profound and lasting. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that any cough, any fever, any sign of weakness might be the beginning of a decline toward death. They watched neighbors and family members die from diseases they could not understand or effectively treat. This created a fatalistic worldview that accepted suffering and death as inevitable parts of life, but also developed remarkable resilience in the face of repeated tragedy. Medieval communities developed social customs around winter illness that reflected both their understanding of disease transmission and their commitment to community survival. They learned to recognize the early signs of serious illness and to make difficult decisions about isolation and care. They developed funeral customs that could be practiced even in the worst weather conditions. They created support systems for households that lost adult members to disease, understanding that community survival depended on maintaining as many productive units as possible. Religious faith played a crucial role in how medieval people understood and responded to winter illness. Disease was often viewed as divine punishment for sin, or as a test of faith sent by God. This theological framework could provide comfort and meaning in the face of suffering, but it could also create additional psychological burden for those who believed their illness reflected their moral inadequacy. Yet even in the face of medieval winter's medical challenges, communities developed remarkable adaptive strategies. They learned which herbs and treatments provided genuine relief, even if they didn't understand why. They created informal medical knowledge networks where experienced healers shared information about successful treatments. They developed community care systems that ensured sick people received basic necessities even when their own families were unable to provide them. The interconnection of cold, hunger, and disease in medieval winter created a spiral of vulnerability that could destroy entire communities. Cold weakened the body's defenses against illness. Hunger reduced the resources available for fighting infection. Disease prevented people from performing the labor necessary to maintain warmth and find food. Breaking this cycle required not just individual resilience, but community cooperation and mutual support that represented some of the most sophisticated social technologies the medieval world developed. Beyond cold, beyond hunger, beyond disease, medieval winter brought with it an enemy that attacked not just the body but the mind itself. Darkness. This was not the manageable darkness we know today, easily banished by the flip of a switch or the strike of a match, but darkness as a fundamental condition of existence, a presence that dominated life for months at a time and shaped every aspect of human experience during the coldest season. Medieval winter days were short, but more significantly, they were dim. Even during daylight hours, the weak winter sun provided little illumination through the small windows of medieval buildings, and cloud cover, frequent during winter storms, could make midday as dark as evening. The quality of light itself was different, filtered through windows made of oiled cloth or crude glass that transformed even bright sunshine into a pale, inadequate glow. The scarcity of artificial light made darkness not just an inconvenience, but an economic burden. Candles were expensive, made from animal fat or beeswax that required considerable resources to produce. A single candle might burn for only a few hours, and its flickering flame provided light barely adequate for the most essential tasks. Oil lamps offered slightly better illumination, but required oil that was costly and sometimes scarce. Most medieval people lived by firelight when they had fuel for fires, and in complete darkness when they did not. This pervasive darkness fundamentally altered the rhythm of medieval winter life. Work that could be performed during long summer days became impossible when daylight lasted only a few hours. Activities that required precision or attention to detail had to be compressed into the brief window of available light. creating intense periods of activity followed by long hours of enforced idleness. The very concept of productivity changed during winter months, when entire days might pass without any work being accomplished simply because there was insufficient light to work by. The psychological impact of medieval winter darkness was profound and cumulative. Modern psychology recognizes seasonal affective disorder as a real condition caused by insufficient light exposure. But medieval people had no such understanding of their winter melancholy. They experienced depression, irritability, and despair as natural consequences of winter's arrival, not as medical conditions that might be treated or prevented. Medieval winter darkness also increased the danger of everyday activities. Moving around dwellings or communities in darkness carried constant risk of injury from uneven surfaces, sharp objects, or obstacles that were invisible in the dim light. Fires, essential for warmth and light, became more dangerous when people had to tend them in darkness, leading to burns and sometimes to catastrophic house fires that could destroy entire households. The social consequences of winter darkness were as significant as its physical effects. Activities that brought communities together during warmer months became difficult or impossible when they required light that was not available. Evening gatherings, storytelling sessions, and other forms of social interaction were curtailed by the expense and scarcity of artificial light. This isolation compounded the other hardships of winter, creating loneliness and social fragmentation when community support was most needed. Medieval people developed strategies for managing winter darkness that required both creativity and careful resource management. They learned to perform familiar tasks by touch when light was insufficient for vision. They organized their days around the available light, completing essential activities during the brightest hours and reserving simpler tasks for times when illumination was poor. They developed sleep patterns that took advantage of the long nights, though sleeping in cold conditions was itself challenging. The religious significance of light took on special meaning during medieval winter darkness. Churches, with their larger windows and more abundant candles, became refuges of illumination as well as spiritual comfort. Religious festivals that celebrated light, such as Christmas, with its emphasis on the Star of Bethlehem, or Candlemas, with its blessing of candles, provided both practical resources and psychological relief from the oppressive darkness. Medieval craftspeople adapted their work to winter's light limitations in ways that affected the entire economy of medieval communities. Blacksmiths, whose work required precise vision, might complete most of their essential tasks during autumn and early winter when some daylight was still available. Textile workers developed techniques for working by touch and firelight. Food preparation, always challenging in winter conditions, became even more difficult when performed in near darkness. The darkness of medieval winter also shaped cultural and literary traditions that have persisted for centuries. Winter became associated with death, sorrow, and hardship in ways that went beyond its practical challenges. Stories told during long winter nights often reflected themes of darkness, danger, and supernatural threat that mirrored the real fears of people living through months of inadequate light and constant vulnerability. Yet medieval communities also found ways to create beauty and meaning within winter's darkness. They developed traditions of storytelling that could be practiced without light, passing down cultural knowledge and entertainment through oral traditions that flourished during winter's enforced gatherings. They created music and poetry that reflected winter's challenges, but also celebrated human resilience in the face of those challenges. The interaction between darkness and winter's other hardships created compound effects that were greater than the sum of their parts. Darkness made it more difficult to tend fires effectively increasing the risk of cold-related death. It complicated food preparation and made it harder to monitor food stores for spoilage. It increased the danger of falls and injuries when people were already weakened by cold and hunger. It made medical care more difficult precisely when illness was most common and most dangerous. Understanding medieval winter darkness helps explain why so many aspects of medieval culture emphasized light as a symbol of hope, divine intervention, and salvation. For people who lived through months of inadequate illumination, light was not just a practical necessity, but a spiritual metaphor that carried deep emotional resonance. The promise of spring's return was not just about warmer weather and growing crops, but about the return of light itself to a world that had been dominated by darkness for far too long. Even in the harshest depths of medieval winter, when cold and hunger and darkness seemed to have conquered all possibility of human joy, there were moments fragile, precious, and brief when communities found ways to create beauty, meaning, and connection. These were not grand celebrations or elaborate festivities, but small acts of human resilience that insisted on finding light within the darkness, warmth within the cold, abundance within scarcity. Picture a December evening in a medieval village, perhaps in the year 1289, when the first heavy snows have already fallen and the community has settled into winter's rhythm of survival. In one modest dwelling, a family has managed to save a small portion of their precious fuel for something beyond mere necessity. Tonight, they light a fire not just for warmth but for gathering, and in the flickering light of those flames, they create a moment of celebration that transcends their harsh circumstances. The grandmother of the household has saved a handful of precious spices, perhaps a small portion of cinnamon obtained through trade before winter's isolation began, or dried herbs gathered during the autumn months when plants still grew. She uses these to prepare a simple drink, heating water over the fire and adding these treasured seasonings to create something that is part necessity and part luxury. The warm liquid provides essential calories and hydration, but the spices transform it into something special, a reminder that human life can encompass more than mere survival. The children of the household, their eyes bright in the firelight, listen as the adults share stories passed down through generations. These are not written tales but living traditions, stories that have survived because each generation found them worth remembering and retelling. Tonight they might hear the story of Saint Martin, who cut his cloak in half to share with a beggar and was rewarded with a vision of Christ wearing the same cloak. Or perhaps they hear older stories, ones that predate Christianity, about winter spirits and the promise of spring's return. Tales that carry ancient wisdom about enduring hardship and finding hope. Medieval winter celebrations were often centered around religious festivals that provided both spiritual comfort and practical excuse for community gathering. Christmas, occurring near the winter solstice, offered the promise of lengthening days and the theological assurance that divine love could triumph over earthly suffering. The 12 days of Christmas provided multiple opportunities for communities to share what resources they had, to visit neighbors despite harsh weather, and to create moments of joy that would sustain spirits through the worst months ahead. The preparation for these celebrations required sacrifices that made them even more precious. A family might save their best preserved foods for weeks in advance, hoarding small luxuries like dried fruit or nuts that could transform a simple meal into a feast. They might work by firelight to create simple gifts, carved wooden toys, knitted mittens, or small wooden crosses that represented hours of careful labor performed when every moment of warmth and light was precious. Medieval communities also found ways to share resources during winter celebrations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mutual aid. A village might organize a common feast, where each household contributed what they could afford, one family providing grain for bread, another offering preserved meat, a third contributing the fuel necessary to cook a communal meal. These gatherings were not just social events, but survival strategies, ways of ensuring that everyone in the community received adequate nutrition during the most challenging season. The music of medieval winter celebrations was particularly poignant, consisting of songs that could be performed without instruments or with simple items that required no special resources. Voices joining together in familiar melodies created warmth that was both literal, the physical heat generated by gathered bodies, and metaphorical, the emotional warmth of shared experience. These songs often carried themes of endurance, hope, and divine protection that directly addressed the challenges their singers faced. Medieval winter also brought opportunities for activities that were impossible during busier seasons. The long, dark evenings provided time for crafts that required patience and attention to detail. Women might spend winter nights spinning thread or weaving cloth, creating the textiles that would be essential for the coming year. Men might work on wood carving, tool repair, or other maintenance tasks that could be performed by firelight. These activities were not just practical necessities, but forms of meditation, ways of finding peace and purpose during months when outdoor work was impossible. The storytelling traditions that flourished during medieval winter evenings served multiple functions beyond entertainment. They preserved cultural knowledge, passing down information about survival techniques, moral lessons, and community history. They provided education for children who had no access to formal schooling. They created shared cultural references that strengthened community bonds. And they offered escape from immediate hardships through tales of adventure, romance, and triumph over adversity. Medieval winter communities also developed traditions around the care of animals that reflected both practical necessity and genuine affection. Livestock were brought into or near human dwellings for protection from cold and predators, creating unusual intimacy between people and animals. Families might share their warmth with a favorite cow or pig, understanding that the animal's survival was essential to their own future welfare. These relationships often developed into genuine bonds of affection that provided emotional comfort during the isolation of winter months. The few travelers brave enough or desperate enough to venture forth during medieval winter were received with hospitality that reflected both Christian charity and practical understanding that anyone might someday need such assistance. The arrival of a merchant, pilgrim, or messenger was cause for celebration, bringing news from the outside world, and often small luxuries that had been obtained during warmer weather. These visitors were welcomed not just as guests, but as connections to a larger world that winter had made seem distant and unreachable. Medieval winter also created opportunities for intimate family bonding that were rare during busier seasons. Parents had time to focus attention on their children, teaching them skills, songs, and stories that would shape their adult lives. Extended families crowded together for warmth, rediscovered relationships that might have been neglected during months of agricultural labor. Marriages and partnerships deepened as couples faced survival challenges together, learning to depend on each other in ways that fair weather never required. Even the physical hardships of medieval winter sometimes created unexpected moments of beauty. A village covered in pristine snow could transform into something magical, its familiar buildings and pathways made new and strange by winter's artistry. Ice formations on windows and roofs created natural sculptures that caught and reflected firelight in ways that brought wonder even to people accustomed to hardship. The sharp clarity of extremely cold air could make stars appear brighter and more numerous than ever, providing spectacular night skies for those brave enough to venture outside. The religious life of medieval communities often intensified during winter months, as people sought divine comfort for earthly suffering. Churches became refuges not just from cold, but from despair, places where communities gathered to pray for survival, to remember the dead, and to affirm their faith in eventual redemption. These gatherings provided psychological support that was as essential as physical warmth, reminding isolated individuals that they were part of a larger human family united by shared beliefs and common struggles. Medieval winter crafts often reached their highest artistic achievements during the darkest months, when time and necessity combined to produce objects of genuine beauty. Textiles created during long winter evenings might feature intricate patterns and careful workmanship that reflected hours of patient labor. Wood carvings completed during winter months often showed exceptional detail and creativity, as craftspeople had time to perfect techniques and experiment with designs. These objects represented the human capacity to create beauty even in the most challenging circumstances. As winter reaches its deepest point in your medieval world, time itself seems to slow and thicken like honey in cold air. The months stretch endlessly ahead, each day a small victory over forces that seem determined to prove human life unsustainable. Yet within this apparent eternity of hardship, subtle signs begin to appear that speak of change, of cycles continuing despite appearances, of hope that refuses to be extinguished even in winter's darkest moments. February in the medieval world was perhaps the cruelest month, the time when winter had lasted long enough to exhaust most resources, but not long enough to offer genuine hope of spring's return. Food stores reached their lowest point, carefully rationed supplies dwindling to portions that barely sustained life. Fuel reserves, hoarded since autumn, had been consumed by the relentless demands of heating and cooking. The psychological weight of winter had accumulated to nearly unbearable levels, testing every bond of family and community that held medieval society together. Yet, even in February's depths, those who knew how to look could find signs that winter's absolute dominion was beginning to weaken. Days, though still short and cold, had begun to lengthen almost imperceptibly since the winter solstice. The quality of light, still weak and pale, carried subtle differences that suggested the sun's growing strength. Snow that had seemed permanent began to show slight changes in texture and consistency, hinting at the possibility of eventual melting. Medieval people, their survival dependent on reading natural signs with precision, developed sophisticated ability to detect these early harbingers of spring. They noticed changes in animal behavior. Birds that had been completely absent beginning to appear in small numbers. Domestic animals showing slightly different patterns of activity. Even rats and mice, behaving in ways that suggested their primitive senses, detected environmental changes invisible to human perception. The first hints of spring in medieval communities often appeared not in the natural world, but in human behavior and planning. Experienced farmers and housekeepers began preparing for activities that were still weeks or months, await-checking stored seeds for viability, inventorying tools that would be needed for spring planting, beginning to plan the massive tasks of plowing, sowing, and rebuilding that would be necessary once winter's grip finally loosened. Medieval communities used various traditional methods to track winter's progress and anticipate spring's arrival. Some relied on religious calendars that connected seasonal change to Christian festivals. Candlemas in early February marked the halfway point through winter, while later celebrations provided benchmarks for measuring progress toward warmer weather. Others used folk wisdom passed down through generations, watching for specific natural signs or counting days from particular events. The anticipation of spring in medieval communities was not just about improved weather and growing conditions, but about reconnection with the wider world. Winter's isolation would end, allowing travel and trade to resume. News from other communities, other regions, other countries would begin to flow again. Merchants would arrive with goods that had been unavailable during winter months. Pilgrims would resume their journeys to holy sites. Young people would once again have opportunities to meet potential marriage partners from neighboring villages. Medieval spring preparation required careful balance between hope and realism. Communities had to begin planning for activities that assumed winter would end, while still conserving resources to survive if winter lasted longer than expected. Seeds had to be readied for planting, but also protected in case additional weeks of storage were necessary. Tools had to be prepared for spring work, but fuel for heating could not be diverted to workshop fires until absolutely certain that the coldest weather had passed. The first genuine signs of winter's retreat created excitement in medieval communities that is difficult for us to imagine. The first day when ice began to melt noticeably during daylight hours was cause for celebration. The first appearance of green shoots pushing through snow was greeted as miraculous. The first day when outdoor work could be performed for several hours without immediate danger from cold was marked as a community milestone. Medieval people understood that spring's arrival was not a single event, but a gradual process that could be interrupted by sudden returns to winter weather. Late snowstorms could destroy crops that had been planted too early. Unexpected frosts could kill animals that had been moved to outdoor shelters prematurely. The transition from winter to spring required constant vigilance and careful judgment about when it was safe to assume that winter's worst dangers had passed. Yet, when spring did finally establish itself firmly enough to allow medieval communities to resume normal activities, the relief and joy were profound. The first successful day of plowing, the first meal that included fresh greens, the first evening when people could gather outdoors without immediately dangerous cold. These moments represented not just seasonal change, but affirmation of human survival, evidence that another cycle of life would be possible. The arrival of spring also brought the sobering task of assessing winter's damage. Communities counted those who had not survived the cold months, mourned the dead, and began the work of caring for those who had been injured or permanently weakened by winter's hardships. Buildings damaged by cold, ice, and storms required repair. Tools and equipment that had deteriorated during months of harsh use needed replacement or renovation. Medieval spring was a season of frantic activity as communities rushed to make up for months of enforced idleness. Fields had to be prepared and planted within narrow windows of optimal weather. Food stores that had been exhausted during winter needed to be replenished through foraging, early crops, and renewed trade relationships. Social connections that had been strained by winter's isolation required attention and repair. Yet spring also brought renewal that went beyond mere recovery from winter hardship. Young animals were born, representing new life and future security. Plants began to grow, offering both immediate nutrition and hope for future harvests. The natural world revealed its capacity for regeneration, demonstrating resilience that inspired human communities to continue their own struggles for survival and prosperity. The medieval understanding of seasons was deeply cyclical, recognizing that each spring was both an ending and a beginning, the end of winter's trial and the beginning of another year's cycle of growth, harvest, and preparation for the next winter. This perspective provided both comfort and motivation. Comfort in the knowledge that hardship was temporary and cyclical rather than permanent, and motivation to use spring and summer wisely to prepare for the inevitable return of winter's challenges. as we prepare to leave this medieval winter behind and return to our own warm, well-lit, abundantly provisioned world. It is worth pausing to consider what these long months of hardship reveal about the human capacity for endurance, adaptation, and hope. Medieval winter was not just a season of suffering, though suffering was certainly central to the experience. It was also a season that revealed the fundamental structures upon which human civilization depends, the social bonds that make survival possible, and the inner resources that allow people to find meaning even in the most challenging circumstances. The communities that survived medieval winter did so not through individual heroism or superior technology, but through sophisticated systems of mutual support, resource sharing, and collective planning that represented some of humanity's most important social innovations. They learned to balance individual needs against community welfare, to make difficult decisions about resource allocation with wisdom gained through generations of experience, and to maintain hope and purpose even when immediate circumstances offered little reason for optimism. Medieval winter reveals the fundamental importance of preparation and planning in human life. The communities that survived best were those that used abundant seasons to prepare for scarce ones, that understood the cyclical nature of plenty and want, and that developed cultural practices and social institutions designed to help people endure inevitable hardship. This long-term thinking, this ability to sacrifice immediate pleasure for future security, represents one of humanity's most distinctive and important characteristics. The social bonds that held medieval communities together during winter's worst challenges offer lessons about human cooperation that remain relevant today. People learned to share resources not from abstract altruism, but from practical understanding that individual survival depended on community survival. They developed systems of reciprocal obligation that ensured help would be available when needed, and they created cultural values that made mutual aid not just acceptable but honorable. Medieval winter also demonstrates the importance of finding meaning and beauty within hardship, rather than waiting for hardship to end before embracing life's possibilities. The stories, songs, crafts, and celebrations that flourished during winter months show human creativity adapting to severe constraints and discovering that limitation can sometimes inspire rather than prevent artistic and cultural achievement. The relationship between medieval people and their natural environment offers perspective on our own relationship with the forces that sustain and threaten human life. Medieval people understood their vulnerability to natural forces in ways that we, insulated by technology and abundant energy, may have forgotten. Their seasonal rhythms of activity and rest, their careful attention to natural signs and cycles, their integration of work and worship with environmental realities, these patterns suggest ways of living that acknowledge human dependence on natural systems, while still affirming human dignity and agency. Perhaps most importantly, medieval winter reveals the extraordinary resilience of human hope. People who faced months of cold, hunger, darkness, and disease continued to believe in the possibility of better times. They planned for spring even in the depths of winter, created beauty even in harsh circumstances, maintained social connections even when survival seemed to require selfishness, and passed on cultural knowledge even when immediate necessity focused all attention on basic needs. The stories we tell about historical hardship often emphasize either the brutality of past conditions or the heroic character of those who endured them. But medieval winter suggests a more complex truth, that ordinary people, facing extraordinary challenges, developed ordinary virtues: patience, cooperation, ingenuity, faith to extraordinary degrees. They were not heroes in the dramatic sense, but they were heroic in the most important sense. They refuse to allow hardship to destroy their essential humanity. Modern life, with its abundance and security, offers opportunities that medieval people could barely imagine. But modern life also presents challenges that medieval people's seasonal wisdom might help us address. How do we maintain community bonds in societies that emphasize individual achievement? How do we balance present consumption with future needs in a world of apparently unlimited resources? How do we find meaning and purpose when basic survival is not threatened but deeper forms of fulfillment remain elusive? Medieval winter cannot provide simple answers to these modern questions, but it can provide perspective. It reminds us that human happiness and meaning have never depended primarily on material abundance, that the most important human needs are social and spiritual rather than physical, and that the capacity to endure hardship with dignity and hope represents one of our species' most admirable characteristics. The medieval people whose winter we have shared understood something that we might have forgotten: that hardship shared becomes more bearable, that preparation makes crisis manageable, that hope sustained through dark times becomes stronger and more reliable, and that human life finds its deepest meaning, not in comfort, but in connection to other people, to natural cycles, to purposes larger than immediate self. As spring eventually came to those medieval communities, bringing relief from winter's trials and opportunity for renewal, so too must we trust that our own seasons of difficulty will pass, that patience and preparation and mutual support will see us through challenges that seem overwhelming, and that the human capacity to create meaning, beauty, and connection will survive whatever hardships we face. Epilogue. Rest now, gentle soul, and so our long journey through medieval winter draws to its close, dear listener. We have walked together through the brutal cold of those distant centuries, felt the hunger that gnawed at empty stomachs, shivered in the darkness that seemed eternal, and witnessed the remarkable ways that ordinary people found to survive, to hope, and even to create beauty in the face of hardship that would challenge the strongest among us. As you lie here now in your warm bed, in your heated room, surrounded by the abundance and security that medieval people could barely imagine, I hope you feel not just gratitude for your comfort, but connection to those long ago communities who faced winter's trials with courage, wisdom, and unwavering faith in the eventual return of spring. Their struggles were real, their suffering profound, but their resilience was extraordinary, and something of that same resilience lives within you. The medieval winter we have experienced together is ending now, as all winters must. Spring comes gradually, bringing longer days, returning birds, the first green shoots pushing through the last snow. The communities we have visited will emerge from their long trial changed but not broken, ready to plant new crops, rebuild what winter damaged, and prepare once again for the cycles that govern all human life. In your own life, dear listener, you may face seasons that feel like medieval winter times, when resources seem scarce, when darkness appears overwhelming, when survival itself requires all your strength and attention. When those seasons come, remember the lessons from these long ago communities, that preparation helps, that sharing burdens makes them lighter, that hope sustained through difficulty becomes deeper and more reliable, and that spring always, eventually, returns. Sleep now, knowing that you are part of a human family that has endured every possible hardship and discovered ways not just to survive, but to find meaning, create beauty, and maintain hope even in the darkest times. Let the struggles of medieval winter fade into the peaceful rest you deserve, carrying with you only the warmth of human connection across the centuries and the quiet confidence that whatever challenges await you, you possess the same fundamental resilience that carried your ancestors through their longest, darkest nights. Sweet dreams, gentle traveler. May your rest be peaceful, your sleep deep and restorative, and your awakening filled with gratitude for the warmth, the light, and the abundance that surround you. Until we meet again in this quiet corner of the night, where history whispers its secrets and ancient wisdom offers comfort to weary souls, rest well. The medieval winter has ended, spring has returned, and you, having witnessed the worst that human hardship can offer, and the best that human nature can provide in response, can sleep peacefully, knowing that hope, like spring, always finds a way to return. In the deep silence of medieval winter nights, when wind howled through gaps in stone walls and frost painted intricate patterns on whatever surfaces it could find, the very buildings that sheltered human life told their own stories of adaptation, compromise, and the eternal struggle between human ingenuity and nature's relentless power. These structures, from the humblest peasant cottage to the grandest castle, were not merely places to live, but carefully engineered fortresses designed to wage war against winter's assault. The medieval dwelling was fundamentally different from anything we might recognize as comfortable habitation today. Every design decision, every construction technique, every architectural choice reflected hard-won knowledge about what winter could do to human shelter and what humans could do, with limited resources and primitive technology, to create spaces where life might endure until spring's return. Consider the typical peasant cottage of 13th century England, where perhaps 8 or 10 people might spend the winter months in a space no larger than a modern bedroom. The walls were often constructed from whatever materials were locally available: stone, if it could be quarried nearby; timber, if forests provided adequate supply; or more commonly, a combination of wood, clay, and straw that created what builders called wattle and daub construction. These walls were thick by necessity, not by choice. Medieval builders understood intuitively what modern engineers express in complex formulas about thermal mass and insulation values. A wall 2 feet thick provided better protection against cold than one built thinner, but it also required more materials, more labor, and more skill to construct properly. The thickness came not from any single material, but from layered construction: an outer shell of stone or timber, an inner layer of clay and straw, sometimes an air gap filled with whatever insulating material could be found. But even the thickest medieval wall was riddled with gaps that modern construction would consider catastrophic failures. The technology for creating tight seals between materials simply did not exist. Mortar was crude and often mixed with materials like animal hair or chopped straw that were intended to provide binding strength, but also created spaces where cold air could penetrate. Wood warped and shrank as it dried and aged, creating gaps that widened with each passing winter. Medieval builders compensated for these structural inadequacies through design strategies that worked with winter rather than simply opposing it. They built homes partially into hillsides when geography allowed, using the earth itself as insulation and windbreak. They oriented buildings to take advantage of whatever solar heating was available during brief winter days, positioning the main living spaces to receive maximum sunlight while placing storage areas and workshops on the side most exposed to winter winds. The roof of a medieval dwelling was perhaps its most critical component for winter survival, and also its most vulnerable. Thatch made from straw, reeds, or other organic materials provided excellent insulation when properly maintained, but it absorbed moisture, supported the growth of mold and insects, and could become dangerously heavy when soaked with rain or covered with snow. A thatched roof might collapse under the weight of a heavy winter storm, destroying not just the building, but potentially killing or injuring the people sheltering beneath it. Stone or slate roofing was more durable but also more expensive and technically challenging to install. These materials provided better protection against fire and weather, but they were also heavier and required stronger structural support. They conducted cold more readily than thatch, making the spaces beneath them colder during winter months. Most importantly, they were simply beyond the economic reach of common people, marking the difference between the dwellings of the wealthy and those of everyone else. The medieval approach to windows represented one of the most difficult compromises that builders faced. Light was precious, especially during winter months when daylight was scarce and artificial illumination expensive. But every window was also a potential source of heat loss, a weak point in the building's thermal envelope where cold could enter and warmth could escape. Medieval windows were therefore small, few in number, and often designed to be sealed completely during the worst weather. Glass, when it was available at all, was crude and expensive. Most medieval windows were covered with oiled cloth, animal hide scraped thin enough to admit some light, or wooden shutters that could be closed against cold but which then eliminated all natural illumination. The wealthy might afford small panes of glass set in lead frames, but even these provided minimal protection against cold and often broke during severe weather. The interior arrangement of medieval dwellings reflected sophisticated understanding of how to maximize warmth and minimize heat loss during winter months. The main living space was typically centered around a hearth that served simultaneously for cooking, heating, and light. This hearth was not just a fireplace in our modern sense, but the organizational center of the entire building, the focal point around which all winter life revolved. Medieval hearths were often nothing more than stone-lined depressions in the floor, with smoke escaping through holes in the roof or, in more sophisticated structures, through crude chimneys. The fire burned continuously during winter months when fuel was available, tended by family members who took turns maintaining it through the night. The area immediately around the hearth was where people worked, ate, and slept during the coldest weather, creating a small zone of relative warmth within the larger cold space of the dwelling. The sleeping arrangements in medieval winter dwellings prioritized warmth over privacy or comfort. Entire families slept together in beds that were often nothing more than platforms of wood or stone, covered with whatever soft materials could be accumulated: straw, feathers, animal skins, or textile scraps. These communal sleeping arrangements were not just economical but practical, allowing family members to share body heat during the coldest nights. Medieval beds, when they existed as separate pieces of furniture, were designed with winter survival in mind. They were raised off the floor to avoid the coldest air that settled at ground level. They were often partially enclosed with curtains or wooden panels that could be drawn to create a smaller space that could be warmed more effectively by body heat. The mattresses were thick not for comfort but for insulation, filled with materials that would trap air and provide barrier against cold. Storage within medieval dwellings was integrated with heating strategy in ways that modern homes never require. Food stores were positioned where they would benefit from whatever heat the dwelling could provide without being so close to fires that they would spoil or burn. Root vegetables were often stored in cellars beneath the main living space, where earth provided consistent, cool temperatures that prevented both freezing and spoilage. Grain storage required particular attention during winter months. Granaries needed to be dry enough to prevent mold and mildew, but they also needed to be accessible even during the worst weather. Many medieval dwellings incorporated grain storage into the main living space, with large wooden chests or stone-lined pits that could be monitored and accessed without leaving the heated areas of the building. The integration of animals into medieval winter dwellings was not just about protecting valuable livestock, but about maximizing available heat sources. Cattle, pigs, goats, and chickens were often housed in spaces directly connected to human living areas, or even within the same rooms where people slept and worked. The body heat generated by these animals contributed significantly to the overall warming of the dwelling, while their presence also made it easier to care for them during severe weather. This arrangement created its own challenges: odors, waste disposal, increased humidity, and health concerns that medieval people accepted as necessary trade-offs for survival. The smell of a medieval dwelling during winter months was a complex mixture of wood smoke, human bodies, animal presence, stored food, and whatever cleaning materials were available. By modern standards, these conditions would be considered barely habitable, but they represented sophisticated adaptation to environmental challenges that left few other options. Medieval castle architecture represents the ultimate expression of winter survival design, scaled up to accommodate not just individual families, but entire communities during times of siege or extreme weather. Castle walls were often 10 or 15 feet thick, constructed from massive stones fitted together with mortar and filled with rubble that provided both structural strength and thermal mass. These walls could absorb heat during brief periods of warmth and release it slowly as temperatures dropped, moderating the internal climate of the castle. The great halls of medieval castles were designed to accommodate large numbers of people during winter months, with enormous fireplaces that could burn entire tree trunks and provide heat for spaces that might accommodate hundreds of individuals. These halls were often the only spaces in the castle that could be heated effectively, making them communal living areas where normal social hierarchies were temporarily suspended in favor of shared warmth. Castle kitchens were marvels of medieval engineering, designed to provide food for large populations, using fuel sources that had to be carefully managed throughout winter months. These kitchens often featured multiple fireplaces, ovens built into thick walls that retained heat for hours after fires died down, and chimney systems that drew smoke away from work areas while retaining as much heat as possible within the building. The private chambers of castle dwellers represented the height of medieval winter comfort, but even these spaces were cold and uncomfortable by modern standards. They might feature individual fireplaces, thick tapestries, or wooden paneling that provided some insulation, and beds with elaborate curtain systems that could be closed to create small, warm sleeping environments. But even the wealthiest medieval people spent their winter months cold, drafty, and uncomfortable, surrounded by luxury that was still primitive compared to the heating systems that even modest modern homes take for granted. Medieval builders also developed techniques for emergency winter shelter that could mean the difference between life and death. When main dwellings were damaged or destroyed during winter storms, they understood how to construct temporary shelters from whatever materials were available: branches, animal skins, snow itself that could provide life-saving protection during severe weather. These techniques were passed down through generations as essential survival knowledge, used when houses burned, roofs collapsed, or when travel during winter became necessary. The maintenance of medieval dwellings during winter months was a constant challenge that required both skill and luck. Roofs had to be cleared of snow before they collapsed under excessive weight, but this work was dangerous and could result in serious injury or death. Walls had to be patched when frost damage created new gaps, but the materials for such patches were often the same materials needed for fuel. Chimneys had to be cleaned to prevent fires, but climbing onto roofs during winter weather carried enormous risks. Medieval communities developed social systems for building, maintenance that distributed both labor and risk among multiple families. Neighbors helped neighbors with roof repairs, sharing both the work and the danger. Communities pooled resources to maintain common buildings, like churches and mills, that were essential for everyone's survival. Young men took on the most dangerous maintenance tasks, while older community members contributed knowledge about repair techniques and material preparation. The psychological impact of medieval dwelling design cannot be understated. These buildings were not homes in our modern sense, places designed for comfort, privacy, and individual expression, but survival shelters designed to keep people alive until better weather returned. They were crowded, cold, dark, and often smelly, but they were also refuges from conditions outside that could kill within hours. The people who lived in them understood that their survival depended not just on the building itself, but on their ability to work together, share resources, and maintain the social bonds that made communal survival possible. Living through a medieval winter in one of these dwellings required psychological adaptation as much as physical endurance. People had to adjust their expectations, accepting discomfort as normal and finding satisfaction in small improvements of fire that burned a little brighter, a meal that was a little warmer, a night when the wind didn't whistle quite so loudly through gaps in the walls. They had to find ways to maintain privacy and personal dignity within spaces that offered neither, creating social customs and personal practices that made communal living bearable. The architecture of medieval winter survival also tells us something important about human ingenuity under extreme constraints. These buildings were not inferior versions of modern homes, but sophisticated solutions to specific challenges, created by people who understood their environment intimately and who used whatever resources were available to create spaces where human life could persist under conditions that would challenge even modern technology. In the depths of medieval winter, when snow buried the pathways between villages and ice sealed the rivers that served as highways during warmer months, an entirely different economic system came into operation, one governed not by the market forces of supply and demand that we understand today, but by the harsh mathematics of survival, where every resource had to be carefully calculated against the unknowable length of winter's duration. The medieval winter economy was fundamentally about time, specifically about the race between the depletion of stored resources and the return of productive seasons. Communities faced the challenge of managing finite stores of food, fuel, raw materials, and human energy across months of weather that made replenishment impossible. This created economic relationships and decision-making processes that were unlike those of any other season, transforming the social and commercial life of medieval communities in ways that touched every aspect of daily existence. Unlike modern economies, where scarcity is often artificial or temporary, medieval winter scarcity was absolute and universal. There was no possibility of importing goods from regions with better weather, no technological solutions that could create resources from nothing, no government programs that could provide relief when local resources failed. Each community faced winter with whatever it had managed to accumulate during the productive months. And when those resources were exhausted, there were no alternatives except mutual aid or death. The fundamental unit of medieval winter economy was the household, not just the nuclear family as we understand it today, but the extended economic unit that included family members, servants, apprentices, and sometimes tenants or dependents who lived and worked together as a single economic entity. These households faced winter as unified economic actors, pooling their resources and coordinating their consumption to maximize their chances of survival until spring returned. The process of preparing for winter began immediately after the previous winter ended, with every economic decision throughout the year influenced by the knowledge that survival depended on accumulation and preservation. Peasant families devoted enormous portions of their summer and autumn labor to activities that would only pay dividends during the winter. Months drying and smoking meat, harvesting and storing grain, gathering and stockpiling fuel, repairing and weatherproofing their dwellings. This preparation required sophisticated understanding of preservation techniques that had been developed over generations of trial and error. Different foods required different storage methods, and the failure of any single preservation technique could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and starvation. Grain had to be kept dry but accessible. Meat had to be preserved without spoiling. Vegetables had to be stored in conditions that prevented both freezing and rotting. The knowledge required for successful food preservation was technical, detailed, and literally a matter of life and death. Medieval communities also had to manage the economics of fuel throughout the winter months. Wood was the primary source of energy for heating and cooking, but gathering and storing adequate fuel required enormous amounts of labor during autumn months, when that labor was also needed for harvesting crops and preparing food stores. Communities had to balance the competing demands of food production and fuel gathering. Understanding that inadequate supplies of either could prove fatal, the economics of medieval winter fuel were complicated by questions of ownership and access to resources. Forests were often controlled by wealthy landowners who might restrict access to wood gathering, forcing common people to travel greater distances or pay fees for fuel that was essential to survival. Peasants might have access to fallen branches and dead wood, but be prohibited from cutting living trees, creating shortages that could not be addressed even when fuel sources were visible and available. Medieval winter also created unique labor economics, as most of the work that sustained communities during productive months became impossible when weather turned severe. Agricultural labor ceased almost entirely, construction work became dangerous or impossible, and many forms of craft production were limited by lack of light, cold temperatures, or unavailable raw materials. This meant that communities had to survive winter months with greatly reduced economic productivity, depending entirely on stores accumulated during better weather. The few forms of economic activity that could continue during winter months became extremely important for community survival. Textile production, spinning, weaving, and sewing could be performed indoors by firelight and provided both essential goods and economic activity. During months when little other work was possible, food processing activities like brewing, baking, and butchering could continue as long as raw materials and fuel were available. Tool making and repair, wood carving, and other craft activities helped maintain the equipment that would be essential when productive seasons returned. Medieval winter trade was limited but crucial for community survival. Even when most commerce ceased due to travel difficulties, some goods were so essential that people risked dangerous winter journeys to obtain them. Salt for food preservation, iron for tools and weapons, certain medicines and spices, and sometimes grain from regions that had produced surplus crops. These items moved along winter trade routes that were perilous but necessary. The merchants who engaged in winter trading faced extraordinary risks and demanded premium prices for their services. A journey that might take days during good weather could require weeks during winter conditions, with constant danger from weather, difficult terrain, wild animals, and human brigands who were themselves desperate for resources. The goods carried by winter merchants were often literally worth their weight in silver or gold, making them targets for robbery while also making them essential for community survival. Medieval winter also created its own internal economy within communities, as households traded surplus items for goods they needed more desperately. A family with extra grain might trade it for additional fuel, while another household with surplus preserved meat might exchange it for textiles or tools. These trades were often conducted without money, using barter systems that evaluated goods based on their immediate utility for winter survival rather than their abstract market value. The social economics of medieval winter were as important as the material economics. Communities had to make collective decisions about resource distribution that balanced individual needs against community survival. Should limited medical supplies be used to treat the elderly, whose survival was uncertain, or saved for younger community members who were more likely to recover and contribute to future productivity? Should fuel be distributed equally among all households, or concentrated in fewer locations where it could be used more efficiently? These decisions were often made through informal social processes rather than formal government structures. Community leaders, religious authorities, and respected elders might influence resource distribution. But ultimately, each household had to weigh its own survival needs against its obligations to neighbors and community members. The social bonds that held medieval communities together were tested every winter by these competing demands, and communities that failed to balance individual and collective needs often did not survive as intact social units. Medieval winter economics also included sophisticated systems for managing uncertainty. Communities never knew exactly how long winter would last, how severe the weather would become, or what unexpected challenges might arise. This uncertainty required economic planning that included buffers and contingencies, resources held in reserve against the possibility that winter might be worse or longer than expected. The psychological aspects of medieval winter economics were as challenging as the material aspects. Households had to live for months with the knowledge that their survival depended on resources that were steadily diminishing and could not be replaced until spring returned. Every meal consumed, every fire lit, every piece of cloth or tool used brought the community closer to the point where essential resources might be exhausted before winter ended. Medieval people developed mental strategies for managing this economic anxiety that reflected deep understanding of human psychology under stress. They created rituals around resource consumption that transformed necessary rationing into social customs. They developed storytelling and entertainment traditions that provided psychological relief from constant worry about survival. They maintained religious practices that placed their economic struggles within larger frameworks of meaning and hope. The wealthy in medieval society faced winter economics that were different in scale but similar in fundamental character to those faced by common people. Lords and merchants might have larger resource stores and more diverse assets, but they also had larger populations depending on them for survival. A medieval castle might shelter hundreds of people during winter months, creating economic challenges that were proportionally as difficult as those faced by single households. Wealthy medieval people also faced the additional challenge of maintaining their social status and political authority during seasons when their usual sources of income and power were reduced or eliminated. A lord whose wealth came from agricultural rents received no income during winter months but was still expected to provide leadership, protection, and sometimes direct assistance to the people who depended on him. This created economic pressures that could threaten not just individual survival, but entire social and political systems. The end of medieval winter brought economic challenges as well as relief. Communities that had survived winter months often found themselves with depleted resources, damaged infrastructure, and populations that had been weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and harsh conditions. The transition back to productive economic activity required investment in new crops, repair of buildings and equipment, and often the replacement of livestock or other assets that had been consumed during winter months. Medieval communities also had to assess what lessons each winter had taught them about resource management and survival strategies. Were there preservation techniques that had worked better than others? Had resource distribution systems been fair and effective? What changes in preparation and planning might improve survival chances during the next winter? These assessments shaped community practices and individual behavior for the entire following year, creating cycles of continuous adaptation and improvement. The economy of medieval winter scarcity created human relationships and social institutions that were fundamentally different from those that operated during seasons of plenty. It required individuals to balance self-interest against community welfare, to make decisions based on incomplete information under extreme time pressure, and to maintain social cooperation even when resources were inadequate to meet everyone's needs. These economic challenges shaped medieval society in ways that influenced law, religion, politics, and culture, creating institutions and traditions that reflected the fundamental importance of surviving winter's annual test of human ingenuity and endurance. Among all the members of medieval communities who faced winter's harsh trials, none were more vulnerable, and none faced greater challenges to their basic survival than the children. In an age when medical knowledge was limited, when food was often scarce, and when the simple act of staying warm required constant effort and attention, childhood was not the protected, nurtured experience we know today, but a precarious journey through years when death walked close beside even healthy, well-cared-for young ones. Medieval winter transformed childhood in ways that are difficult for us to comprehend in our modern world of heated homes, abundant food, and advanced medical care. Children who might thrive during summer months, when food was more plentiful and outdoor activities were possible, faced winter challenges that tested their developing bodies and minds in ways that would seem cruel by contemporary standards, but were simply the unavoidable realities of life in a world where survival was never guaranteed. The youngest children, infants and toddlers faced winter dangers that began even before they were born. Medieval women who were pregnant during winter months often suffered from inadequate nutrition, since food stores were typically at their lowest levels during the late winter and early spring when many babies were born. Mothers weakened by hunger and cold had more difficult pregnancies, higher rates of complications during childbirth, and reduced ability to nurse their infants successfully. Newborn babies born during medieval winter entered a world that was immediately hostile to their survival. The warm, consistently heated nurseries that we consider essential for infant care simply did not exist. Medieval babies were born into cold, drafty rooms where maintaining adequate temperature required constant attention to fires that consumed precious fuel. Even wealthy families struggled to keep newborns warm, and for poor families, the challenge was often impossible to meet adequately. Medieval infant clothing was designed with winter survival as the primary consideration. Babies were wrapped in multiple layers of whatever soft materials were available, linen if the family could afford it, wool that had been made as soft as possible through repeated washing and wearing, animal skins that provided warmth but were difficult to keep clean. These wrapping techniques, called swaddling, were not just about comfort but about conservation of body heat in conditions where even brief exposure to cold air could be dangerous. The diet of medieval infants during winter months was entirely dependent on the health and nutrition of their mothers, since breast milk was the only safe food available for babies. But mothers who were themselves undernourished produced less milk, and milk that might be lower in the fats and nutrients that babies needed for healthy development. This created a cycle where maternal malnutrition led to infant malnutrition, which in turn made babies more vulnerable to the diseases and infections that were common during winter months. For families who had lost the mother during childbirth, a tragically common occurrence in medieval times, feeding an infant during winter presented almost insurmountable challenges. Animal milk, when it was available, was difficult to keep fresh and clean during cold months. Medieval people did not understand bacterial contamination, but they observed that babies fed with animal milk were more likely to become sick and die than those who were breastfed. Wet nurses, other women who could provide breast milk, were expensive and often unavailable, especially during winter months when travel between communities was difficult. Medieval toddlers and young children faced winter challenges that affected their growth, development, and long-term health in ways that often persisted throughout their lives. Inadequate nutrition during the crucial early years of development led to stunted growth, delayed developmental milestones, and increased susceptibility to diseases that might not appear until years later. Children who survived medieval winters often bore the physical marks of those experiences in their bone structure, dental development, and overall physical condition. The daily life of medieval children during winter months was dominated by the same survival concerns that affected adults, but with additional vulnerabilities that came from their smaller size. Higher energy needs relative to body weight, and limited ability to understand and manage the dangers they faced. Young children required more calories per pound of body weight than adults, but they were often the last family members to receive adequate food when resources were scarce. Medieval families made heartbreaking decisions about resource allocation that reflected both practical necessity and deep emotional bonds. Parents faced choices between feeding themselves and maintaining their ability to work and provide for the family, or sharing their limited food with children who might not survive winter regardless of how much care they received. These decisions were influenced by cultural beliefs about childhood, family obligations, and community survival that were different from our modern understanding of children's rights and needs. The education of medieval children during winter months was primarily practical rather than academic. Children who were old enough to contribute to family survival learned essential skills that would serve them throughout their lives. They learned to tend fires safely, to help with food preparation and preservation, to care for younger siblings, and to assist with the many tasks required for winter survival. This education was hands-on and immediate, with life-or-death consequences for mistakes or inattention. Medieval children also learned to endure discomfort and hardship with patience and resilience that would serve them well in adulthood. They learned that cold, hunger, and discomfort were normal parts of life rather than problems that adults should solve for them. They developed mental and emotional strategies for managing difficult conditions that reflected sophisticated understanding of human psychology under stress. The play and entertainment of medieval children during winter months was limited by the same resource constraints that affected all aspects of life. Toys were few and precious, often made from scraps of materials left over from essential production. Children learned to find entertainment in activities that required no special materials, storytelling, singing simple games that could be played by firelight in crowded living spaces. Medieval children's games during winter often reflected and prepared them for adult responsibilities. They played at keeping house, at caring for animals, at managing resources and making the kinds of survival decisions they would face as adults. These games were not just entertainment, but preparation for life in a world where childhood was brief and adult responsibilities came early. The health challenges faced by medieval children during winter were numerous and often fatal. Respiratory infections that might be minor inconveniences for modern children were major killers in medieval winter conditions. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung diseases spread rapidly in crowded, poorly ventilated living spaces and often proved fatal for children whose immune systems were compromised by cold and malnutrition. Medieval children were also vulnerable to gastrointestinal diseases that were common during winter months, when food storage conditions were poor and sanitation was difficult to maintain. Diarrheal diseases, which could quickly lead to dehydration and death in young children, were particularly dangerous during cold weather, when maintaining fluid balance was already challenging. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that children who became ill often infected siblings and other family members, creating household epidemics that could devastate entire families. The psychological development of medieval children was profoundly influenced by winter experiences that exposed them to adult concerns about survival, mortality, and resource management from very early ages. Children learned to live with uncertainty about whether they would survive until spring, whether their families would have adequate food and fuel, and whether the community itself would endure winter's challenges. This early exposure to existential threats created psychological characteristics that were different from those of children who grow up in more secure environments. Medieval children developed what we might recognize today as precocious maturity, taking on responsibilities and making decisions that reflected understanding of life and death stakes. They also developed strong bonds with family and community members, understanding intuitively that survival depended on cooperation and mutual support. Medieval children who lost parents during winter months faced particularly severe challenges. Orphaned children had to depend on extended family, community, charity, or religious institutions for survival. But these support systems were often overwhelmed during winter months when everyone faced resource constraints. Children who could not find adequate care might not survive, and those who did survive often carried the emotional and physical scars of winter abandonment throughout their lives. The religious education of medieval children took on special significance during winter months, when thoughts of death and divine intervention were particularly relevant to daily experience. Children learned prayers and religious stories that helped them understand their suffering within larger frameworks of meaning and hope. They learned to view winter hardships as tests of faith that could lead to spiritual rewards, and they developed religious practices that provided comfort during the most difficult times. Medieval childhood was also shaped by seasonal rhythms that are largely absent from modern life. Children learned that winter was a time for different activities, different expectations, and different relationships than other seasons provided. They developed patience and the ability to defer gratification, understanding that spring would eventually bring opportunities for outdoor play, better food, and relief from winter's constraints. The children who survived medieval winters often emerged from those experiences with characteristics that served them well in adulthood: resilience, adaptability, strong family bonds, practical skills, and deep appreciation for security and abundance when they were available. They carried forward cultural knowledge and survival techniques that had been tested under the most challenging conditions, ensuring that communities could continue to survive winter's annual challenges. But medieval winter also claimed children who might have thrived under different circumstances, cutting short lives that could have contributed to their communities and their families. The high mortality rates among medieval children during winter months represented not just personal tragedies, but community losses that affected population growth, cultural transmission, and economic development for generations. The children of medieval winter were both victims and heroes of their harsh circumstances. They endured conditions that would challenge the strongest adults, adapted to limitations that would seem impossible by modern standards, and often emerged from childhood with capabilities and characteristics that enabled them to continue the cycle of survival and adaptation that defined medieval life. Their experiences remind us that childhood, as we understand it today, is a relatively recent invention, and that human children have historically been capable of remarkable resilience when circumstances demanded such strength. Medieval winter was not merely a season of individual survival, but a time that tested the very fabric of human relationships, stretching the bonds between family members, neighbors, and community members until some grew stronger under pressure while others snapped entirely. In a world where survival often depended on cooperation and mutual aid, winter created both the greatest need for human connection and the greatest stress on the relationships that made such connection possible. The nuclear family, as we understand it today, was a luxury that few medieval people could afford during winter months. Extended families, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and sometimes unrelated individuals who had been brought into the household through marriage, adoption, or economic necessity, often lived together in single dwellings where privacy was impossible and every personal habit, character flaw, and emotional response became visible to everyone else in the household. Medieval winter forced these extended family groups to navigate relationships under conditions of extraordinary stress. The same people who might enjoy each other's company during brief summer evenings or autumn celebrations found themselves confined together for months at a time, sharing limited space, competing for access to warmth and light, and witnessing each other's struggles with hunger, illness, and fear. The personality conflicts and interpersonal tensions that might be manageable during seasons when people could spread out and find individual activities became magnified and concentrated during winter's enforced togetherness. The hierarchy within medieval families was both reinforced and challenged by winter conditions. Traditional authority structures with male heads of household making decisions and female household managers controlling domestic activities could be disrupted when survival required different skills and capabilities than those valued during normal times. A household head who was skilled at managing agricultural activities might be less capable than his wife at managing food rationing and preservation. An elderly grandmother might possess crucial knowledge about herbal medicine that made her the most important family member during health crises. Medieval winter also created new forms of intimacy and dependency within families as people shared beds for warmth, took turns tending fires throughout the night, and coordinated their activities around the shared goal of household survival. Adult children who had been asserting independence might find themselves dependent again on parental resources and knowledge. Parents who had been preparing to reduce their involvement in daily household management might find themselves essential for family survival during the most challenging months. The care of elderly family members during medieval winter presented particularly complex challenges that tested both practical resources and emotional bonds. Elderly people often required more food, more warmth, and more attention than younger family members, but they also contributed essential knowledge about survival techniques, food preparation, and crisis management that could mean the difference between life and death for the entire household. Families had to balance the extra resources required to keep elderly members alive against their contributions to family survival and their emotional importance to family unity. Medieval winter marriages were tested by conditions that would challenge even the strongest relationships. Couples who had courted during pleasant summer months found themselves sharing confined spaces under conditions of stress, scarcity, and uncertainty that revealed character traits and compatibility issues that had not been apparent during better times. The romantic aspects of marriage gave way to practical partnerships focused on survival, where emotional support and physical cooperation became more important than passion or personal fulfillment. The birth of children during medieval winter created family dynamics that were both joyful and terrifying. New babies brought hope for the future and strengthened family bonds. But they also increased resource demands at precisely the time when resources were most scarce. Families had to make difficult decisions about how much of their limited fuel could be used to keep a newborn warm. How much of their food stores could be allocated to supporting a nursing mother, and how much attention could be diverted from other survival tasks to care for an infant. Medieval winter neighborhoods developed their own social dynamics that could either strengthen community bonds or create lasting divisions. Between households, neighbors who shared resources generously during winter's worst challenges often formed friendships and mutual aid relationships that lasted for years afterward. But neighbors who were perceived as selfish, dishonest, or unfair in their resource sharing might find themselves excluded from community cooperation long after winter ended. The informal social networks that held medieval communities together were put to their most severe tests during winter months. The systems of reciprocal obligation and mutual assistance that worked well during times of relative abundance could break down when everyone faced serious resource constraints. A household that had always contributed to community welfare might find itself unable to help others and in need of assistance that the community could barely provide. Medieval communities developed sophisticated but often unspoken rules about resource sharing during winter months. These rules governed who would first claim unlimited resources, how surplus goods should be distributed when some households had more than others, and what obligations people had to help neighbors who were facing severe hardship. These community standards were enforced through social pressure rather than formal legal mechanisms, but their violation could result in exclusion from community support systems that were essential for survival. The religious communities that existed within medieval society, both formal religious orders and informal groups of deeply devout individuals, often provided some of the strongest and most reliable support networks during winter months. Monasteries and convents, with their emphasis on communal living and shared resources, sometimes served as models for how secular communities could organize mutual aid during difficult times. Religious beliefs about charity, compassion, and divine providence provided frameworks for understanding winter hardship and motivations for helping others despite personal resource constraints. Medieval winter also created opportunities for leadership and social mobility that were not available during other seasons. Individuals who demonstrated exceptional skill at managing resources, organizing community responses to crises, or maintaining morale during difficult times could gain social status and influence that persisted long after winter ended. Conversely, people who had held authority based on wealth or political connections might find their leadership challenged if they proved ineffective at managing winter survival challenges. The relationships between social classes were both reinforced and complicated by medieval winter experiences. Wealthy landowners who had adequate resources to survive winter comfortably maintained their economic advantages, but they also faced increased pressure to provide assistance to tenants and dependents who might not survive without help. The feudal obligations that governed relationships between lords and peasants included reciprocal responsibilities for protection and support that became particularly important during winter months. Medieval winter romantic relationships, often developed under circumstances that were very different from modern courtship patterns. Young people who had been separated by social conventions during warmer months might find themselves working closely together during winter survival tasks, creating opportunities for relationships that crossed traditional class boundaries. A lord's daughter helping with communal cooking might develop. Friendships with peasant women that would have been impossible during formal social seasons. Young men from different social backgrounds might form bonds while working together to gather fuel or repair storm damage that threatened entire communities. Medieval winter courtship was necessarily practical rather than romantic. Young people who were considering marriage had to evaluate potential partners based on their ability to contribute to winter survival rather than on abstract qualities like beauty, charm, or romantic compatibility. A young woman's skill at food preservation, textile production, and household management became more important marriage qualifications than her dowry or family connections. A young man's strength, resourcefulness, and ability to provide fuel and protection carried more weight than his social status or personal wealth. The compressed social interactions of medieval winter could accelerate relationship development in ways that would seem unusual by modern standards. Young people who might have courted slowly over multiple seasons found themselves in situations where they had to make quick decisions about compatibility and commitment. The shared hardships of winter survival revealed character traits and personal qualities that might have taken years to discover under normal circumstances. Medieval winter also created opportunities for relationships that challenged conventional social arrangements. Households that needed additional labor or resources might informally adopt individuals who could contribute to family survival, creating family bonds that were based on mutual aid rather than blood relationships. Elderly people who had no family support might be welcomed into households where their knowledge and skills were valued, becoming honorary family members through winter survival partnerships. The breakdown of medieval winter relationships often occurred when the stress of survival revealed fundamental incompatibilities or character flaws that had been hidden during easier times. Marriages might dissolve when partners proved unable to work together effectively under pressure. Family relationships might be permanently damaged when some members were perceived as contributing inadequately to survival efforts or as taking unfair advantage of others' sacrifices. Medieval winter violence, while relatively rare due to communities' dependence on cooperation, could be particularly devastating when it occurred within families or close social networks. Domestic conflicts that escalated during months of confinement could result in injuries or deaths that affected entire households' survival chances. Community disputes over resource allocation could create lasting divisions that weakened mutual aid networks for years afterward. The resolution of medieval winter relationship conflicts required sophisticated social skills and community intervention techniques. Extended families developed methods for mediating disputes between household members before they escalated to levels that threatened survival. Communities created informal arbitration processes for resolving conflicts over resource sharing, property boundaries, and mutual obligations that had become complicated by winter survival needs. Medieval winter relationships were also shaped by the constant presence of death and the awareness that any winter might be someone's last. This created both urgency and poignancy in personal relationships, as people understood that opportunities for reconciliation, expression of love, and resolution of conflicts might be limited by mortality that was always near during the harshest season. Families made efforts to resolve old grievances during winter months, understanding that spring might not bring another opportunity for healing damaged relationships. The collective trauma of surviving medieval winter together created bonds between community members that could last for generations, people who had shared resources during the most desperate times, who had nursed each other through illnesses, who had worked together to repair storm damage or fight fires, often formed relationships that transcended normal social boundaries and lasted throughout their lives. These survival partnerships became the foundation for social networks that provided security and support during future challenges. Medieval winter relationships were also influenced by the seasonal rhythm of emotional and physical intimacy. The enforced closeness of winter living arrangements created opportunities for deeper emotional connections between family members and community members, but it also created needs for privacy and individual space that were difficult to satisfy. People learned to create psychological privacy within physically crowded conditions, developing internal emotional resources that allowed them to maintain individual identity while participating in communal survival efforts. The religious dimensions of medieval winter relationships were particularly important, as shared spiritual practices provided frameworks for understanding hardship, maintaining hope, and strengthening community bonds. Families and communities that prayed together, that shared religious observations and seasonal celebrations, that found meaning in winter suffering through Christian theology, often developed stronger social bonds and more effective cooperation than groups that lacked these shared spiritual resources. Medieval winter also created unique mentorship relationships between older and younger community members, as survival required the transmission of crucial knowledge and skills that could only be learned through direct experience. Elder craftspeople took on apprentices during winter months when outdoor work was impossible, teaching techniques for toolmaking, food preparation, and household management that would be essential for the younger generation's future survival. These relationships were intensely personal and practically focused, creating bonds that combined emotional affection with survival necessity. The end of medieval winter brought both relief and assessment to relationships that had been tested by months of hardship. Some relationships emerged stronger, deepened by shared struggle and successful cooperation. Others had been damaged by conflicts, disappointments, or failures of mutual support that might require months or years to heal. Communities used the transition to spring as an opportunity to repair damaged relationships, to acknowledge those whose contributions had been essential for survival, and to prepare social networks for the challenges that the next winter would inevitably bring. The legacy of medieval winter relationships extended far beyond the specific communities and individuals who experienced them. The social technologies developed for managing interpersonal relationships under extreme stress, the cultural values that prioritized mutual aid and collective survival, and the understanding of how human bonds could be both strengthened and tested by shared hardship influenced medieval society throughout the year and across generations. These relationship patterns shaped legal systems, religious practices, economic arrangements, and political structures in ways that reflected the fundamental importance of cooperation for human survival under challenging conditions. In the depths of medieval winter, when death walked so closely beside the living that its presence could be felt in every icy breath and every empty granary, the boundary between the sacred and the earthly became both more defined and more permeable. Religious faith was not merely a source of comfort for medieval people facing winter's trials. It was an essential survival tool, a framework for understanding suffering, and a community resource that could mean the difference between despair and hope during the darkest months of the year. The medieval church understood the spiritual dimensions of seasonal hardship with sophistication born from centuries of ministering to communities that faced annual struggles against cold, hunger, and disease. The liturgical calendar was carefully designed to provide spiritual support precisely when material conditions were most challenging. The celebration of Christmas near the winter solstice offered theological assurance that divine love could triumph over earthly darkness. Epiphany provided promise of divine revelation during months when natural light was scarce. Candlemas, celebrated in early February, blessed the candles that would provide essential illumination during winter's deepest period. The physical churches that served medieval communities during winter months were themselves battlegrounds between sacred aspiration and practical necessity. These buildings, designed to inspire awe and provide refuge for souls seeking divine comfort, also had to serve as practical shelters for communities whose own dwellings might be inadequate for winter survival. Churches often became communal spaces where people gathered not just for religious services, but for warmth, social contact, and mutual aid during the most isolating season. Medieval church architecture during winter months revealed the complex relationship between spiritual and material needs. The large interior spaces that created impressive settings for religious ceremonies were also nearly impossible to heat effectively during cold months. Worshippers attending winter services often wore the same heavy clothing they wore outdoors, their breath visible in the cold air as they sang hymns or recited prayers. The stone floors and walls that created acoustical effects that enhanced religious music also conducted cold that made religious observance a physical trial as well as a spiritual discipline. The medieval clergy faced unique challenges during winter months that tested their spiritual vocation in ways that fair weather never demanded. Priests had to conduct religious services in buildings that were barely warmer than the outdoors, minister to parishioners who were weakened by hunger and disease, and provide spiritual comfort while struggling with their own survival needs. Monasteries and convents, with their emphasis on communal living and shared resources, often provided better models for winter survival than secular communities. But even religious communities faced severe challenges during the harshest weather. Medieval winter religious services took on emotional intensity and practical importance that reflected both spiritual need and community necessity. Weekly masses became opportunities not just for religious observance, but for community assessment: who was absent due to illness, which families needed assistance, what collective challenges required community response. Religious services during winter months often included prayers specifically for survival, for adequate food and fuel, for protection against disease, and for the strength to endure until spring returned. The preaching and religious instruction that occurred during medieval winter months addressed the theological questions that seasonal hardship raised in the minds of believers. Why did a loving God allow such suffering? What spiritual lessons were contained in the trials of cold, hunger, and disease? How should Christians respond to neighbors who were facing starvation or death from winter-related causes? Medieval clergy developed sophisticated theological responses to these questions that provided both comfort and practical guidance for communities struggling with survival challenges. Medieval winter religious festivals were carefully designed to provide psychological and social support during the most challenging times. The 12 days of Christmas extended celebration across the period when daylight was shortest and weather was typically most severe. Religious drama and mystery plays provided entertainment and instruction during long winter evenings when other forms of social activity were impossible. Saint days throughout winter months honored religious figures whose lives provided models for enduring hardship with faith and grace. The saints venerated during medieval winter months were often chosen specifically for their relevance to seasonal challenges. Saint Blaise was invoked for protection against throat ailments that were common during cold months. Saint Sebastian was called upon for protection against plague and epidemic disease. Saint Martin, whose feast day fell in November, was remembered for his charity in dividing his cloak with a beggar, providing a model for winter generosity when resources were scarce. Medieval religious practices during winter months also included many traditions that combined Christian theology with older seasonal customs that predated Christianity. The blessing of homes and livestock during winter months reflected both Christian beliefs about divine protection and ancient practices designed to ensure survival through dangerous seasons. The use of evergreen plants in religious decoration connected Christian celebrations to pre-Christian traditions that honored plant life that remained vital during winter's apparent death. Medieval monasteries during winter months provided some of the most sophisticated examples of how religious communities could organize collective survival while maintaining spiritual discipline. Monastic rules that governed daily life were adapted for winter conditions that required different schedules, different priorities, and different resource management than other seasons demanded. Monks and nuns who had devoted their lives to spiritual contemplation found that winter survival required practical skills and community cooperation that tested their religious vocation in unexpected ways. The religious literature and devotional practices of medieval winter reflected the season's psychological and spiritual challenges. Devotional texts often addressed themes of endurance, patience, and faith under trial that spoke directly to the experiences of people facing winter hardship. Religious poetry and songs celebrated spiritual light during physical darkness, divine warmth during earthly cold, and eternal abundance during temporal scarcity. These literary traditions provided both personal comfort and community resources for maintaining morale during difficult months. Medieval winter religious art and architecture often incorporated symbols and imagery that addressed seasonal themes. Churches built during medieval winters sometimes included decoration that celebrated spring's return, agricultural abundance, and divine provision for human needs. Religious manuscripts illuminated during winter months often featured imagery of seasonal cycles, divine protection of believers, and the promise of eternal spring that awaited faithful souls after earthly trials ended. The relationship between medieval religious faith and practical winter survival was complex and sometimes contradictory. Religious beliefs about divine providence could provide comfort and hope during times when material circumstances seemed hopeless, but they could also create guilt and confusion. When prayers for survival went unanswered or when religious community members died despite faithful observance of spiritual disciplines. Medieval theology developed sophisticated explanations for these apparent contradictions that allowed believers to maintain faith despite experiences that challenged simple understandings of divine justice and protection. Medieval religious communities also struggled with the tension between spiritual ideals of poverty, charity, and self-sacrifice, and the practical necessities of winter survival. Monasteries that had taken vows of poverty still needed adequate food and fuel to survive winter months. Religious communities that emphasized charity and hospitality still had to manage limited resources carefully to ensure their own survival. Individual believers who aspired to spiritual detachment from worldly concerns still had to focus enormous attention on practical matters of food, warmth, and shelter during winter months. The medieval practice of religious pilgrimage was severely constrained during winter months, but the few pilgrims brave enough to travel during cold weather often found enhanced spiritual significance in journeys that involved genuine physical hardship and danger. Winter pilgrimages to holy sites became ultimate expressions of religious devotion, requiring faith that was strong enough to motivate travel under conditions that risked death from cold, hunger, or violence. The religious communities that provided hospitality for winter pilgrims performed acts of charity that were literally life-saving. Medieval winter religious music developed distinctive characteristics that reflected both the acoustic properties of cold churches and the emotional needs of worshippers. Facing seasonal hardship, chants and hymns were often performed with special intensity during winter months, their melodies carrying across cold air in ways that seemed to bridge the gap between earthly suffering and divine comfort. Religious music provided one of the few forms of beauty and transcendence that were readily available during months when most other forms of cultural expression were constrained by survival necessities. The medieval religious understanding of time and eternity took on special meaning. During winter months, when present suffering seemed endless and hope for improvement required faith in unseen future possibilities, religious teachings about eternal life provided comfort for people facing mortality that was more immediate during winter months than during other seasons. Theological concepts about divine time that transcended earthly seasons offered perspective that helped believers endure temporal hardships with patience and faith. Medieval winter religious practices also included many private devotional activities that individuals could perform within their own households when travel to church was impossible due to weather conditions. Personal prayer, meditation on religious texts, and private religious observances provided spiritual resources that did not depend on community gathering or priestly leadership. These individual religious practices often became more intense and more important during winter months when external religious resources were less available. The intersection of medieval religious belief and medical understanding created unique approaches to treating winter illnesses and injuries. Religious communities often maintained the best medical knowledge available, combining herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and nursing care with prayer, spiritual counseling, and religious rituals designed to address both physical and spiritual dimensions of illness. Monasteries and convents sometimes served as hospitals for communities whose secular medical resources were inadequate for winter health challenges. Medieval religious communities also preserved and transmitted practical knowledge about winter survival that was essential for community welfare. Monastic libraries contained texts about agriculture, food preservation, herbal medicine, and craft techniques that were crucial for seasonal survival. Religious communities that maintained these knowledge resources often served as educational centers that helped secular communities develop and improve their winter survival capabilities. The end of medieval winter brought religious observances that combined thanksgiving for survival with preparation for the agricultural and social activities that would occupy the coming year. Religious services celebrating spring's return acknowledged both divine providence in protecting the community through winter's trials and human responsibility to use the coming season wisely in preparation for future winters. These seasonal religious transitions provided frameworks for understanding annual cycles of hardship and renewal that gave meaning to the repetitive challenges of medieval life. As medieval winter tightened its grip on communities across Europe, transforming prosperous towns into isolated outposts and busy trade routes into treacherous passages that few dared attempt. A special class of individuals emerged who were willing to risk everything to move essential goods through landscapes that had become hostile to human travel. These winter merchants were not ordinary traders seeking profit margins and commercial opportunities, but specialists in survival commerce, men and women who understood that their cargo often meant the difference between life and death for the communities they served. The decision to engage in winter trading required a calculation that balanced potential profits against risks that were literally mortal. A merchant who set out from one community with a load of salt, iron tools, or grain-faced weeks of travel through conditions that could kill not only through exposure to cold, but through encounters with wild animals made desperate by hunger. Human brigands, driven to violence by their own survival needs, or natural disasters like avalanches, river flooding, or storms that could destroy both cargo and travelers without warning. Medieval winter merchants developed specialized knowledge and equipment that distinguished them from fair-weather traders. They learned to read weather signs with the precision of farmers, understanding how cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior could predict storms that might trap them in open country without shelter. They developed relationships with blacksmiths and leather workers, who could provide equipment specifically designed for winter travel, special shoes for horses that provided better grip on ice, clothing systems that could keep humans warm and dry during weeks of outdoor exposure, and sleigh or cart designs that could navigate snow-covered roads. The routes followed by medieval winter merchants were often entirely different from those used during warmer months. Rivers that served as highways during summer might be frozen solid, allowing direct travel across terrain that was normally impossible to cross, but also creating dangers from thin ice that could break under the weight of loaded carts. Mountain passes that were accessible during good weather became death traps during winter storms. Coastal routes that were safe during calm weather became impossible when winter storms made sea travel suicidal. Medieval winter merchants also had to develop specialized relationships with communities along their routes. They needed to identify households or inns that would provide shelter and supplies during their journeys, often paying premium prices for accommodations that might be minimal but were essential for survival. They had to understand local customs about hospitality, payment, and trade that might be different during winter months when communities were operating under survival conditions rather than normal commercial arrangements. The goods carried by medieval winter merchants were typically items that were so essential for survival that communities would pay almost any price to obtain them. Salt for food preservation might be worth its weight in silver during winter months when it was the only way to prevent meat from spoiling. Iron for tools and weapons commanded premium prices when communities needed to repair equipment that was essential for survival tasks. Certain medicines and spices might be literally priceless when they offered the only hope for treating winter illnesses that could kill entire families. Medieval winter trading also created unique forms of credit and payment, arrangements that reflected the seasonal economy's constraints. Communities that desperately needed goods during winter months might not have cash or tradable commodities available until after spring harvests. Winter merchants had to be willing to extend credit arrangements that might not be settled for months, or to accept payment in goods that would be produced during future seasons. These credit arrangements required trust, relationships that went far beyond normal commercial transactions. The social status of medieval winter merchants was complex and often contradictory. They were respected for their courage and for the essential services they provided, but they were also suspected of profiteering from others' desperation. They were welcomed as heroes when they arrived with needed supplies, but they were also resented for the high prices they charged for goods that were essential for survival. Some communities honored winter merchants as almost religious figures who risked their lives to serve others, while other communities viewed them as opportunists who exploited winter hardship for personal gain. Medieval winter merchants often traveled in groups for safety and mutual support, creating merchant caravans that could provide protection against brigands and assistance when individual merchants faced equipment failures or health emergencies. These merchant bands developed their own social hierarchies, leadership structures, and codes of conduct that governed how risks and profits would be shared among group members. The bonds formed between winter merchants often lasted for years, creating professional relationships that transcended individual trading ventures. The families of medieval winter merchants faced unique challenges during the months when their primary income earners were traveling through dangerous conditions. Merchant families never knew whether their fathers, husbands, or brothers would return from winter trading expeditions, creating anxiety and uncertainty that lasted for months at a time. These families had to manage their own winter survival while also dealing with the emotional stress of not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Medieval winter merchants also served important functions beyond simple goods exchange. They carried news between communities that had been isolated by winter conditions, providing information about political developments, military conflicts, or natural disasters that might affect community planning and survival strategies. They sometimes carried letters and messages between family members who had been separated by winter travel constraints. They brought reports about conditions in other regions that could help. Communities assessed their own relative success or failure in managing winter challenges. The route planning required for medieval winter trading was extraordinarily complex and required detailed knowledge of geography, weather patterns, political conditions, and resource availability across large regions. Merchants had to know which communities would welcome traders during winter months and which might be too desperate or too suspicious to provide safe reception. They had to understand which political authorities controlled different territories and what taxes, tolls, or permissions might be required for winter travel. They had to predict which routes would remain passable during different types of winter weather. Medieval winter merchants also had to develop sophisticated risk management strategies that went far beyond normal commercial planning. They had to decide how much of their own resources to invest in any single trading expedition, knowing that the loss of a winter cargo could bankrupt them or leave their own families without resources for survival. They had to plan for contingencies like equipment failure, illness, or political conflict that might prevent them from completing planned routes or accessing expected markets. The warehousing and storage facilities used by medieval winter merchants were often crude by modern standards, but represented sophisticated solutions to the challenges of preserving goods. During months when temperatures fluctuated above and below freezing, merchants had to understand how different types of goods would be affected by cold, moisture, and temperature changes, and they had to develop storage and transportation methods that would preserve product quality during weeks or months of difficult conditions. Medieval winter trading also created opportunities for technological innovation as merchants and craftspeople worked to develop better solutions for winter travel and cargo protection. New designs for sleds and carts, improved techniques for waterproofing goods and equipment, better methods for preserving food during long journeys, and enhanced approaches to cold weather clothing and shelter all emerged from the practical needs of winter commerce. The legal frameworks that governed medieval winter trading were often different from those that applied during normal commercial seasons. Communities might suspend normal trade regulations during winter months when survival needs took precedence over regulatory compliance. Legal authorities might be more lenient about taxation or licensing requirements for merchants who were providing essential services during emergency conditions. At the same time, communities might also impose special regulations designed to prevent price gouging or to ensure that essential goods were distributed fairly among community members. Medieval winter merchants often specialized in particular types of goods or particular geographical regions, developing expertise that allowed them to operate more efficiently and safely than generalist traders. Some merchants focused on luxury goods like spices and fine textiles that could command very high prices but were not essential for survival. Others specialized in bulk commodities like grain and salt that were essential for community survival but required different transportation and storage techniques. The end of medieval winter brought both relief and new challenges for winter merchants. The return of normal travel conditions meant safer journeys and reduced prices for transportation and accommodation. But it also meant increased competition from fair weather merchants and reduced demand for the premium price services that made winter trading profitable. Many winter merchants used the profits from their dangerous winter expeditions to invest in safer spring and summer trading activities, or to acquire property and resources that would provide security for their families during future winters. Medieval winter trading also influenced the development of financial institutions and commercial practices that would become important features of medieval economic development. The credit arrangements, risk-sharing agreements, and international trade relationships developed by winter merchants provided models for banking and commercial organization that were used throughout the medieval period. The information networks created by winter merchants became foundations for intelligence systems that served both commercial and political purposes. The cultural impact of medieval winter merchants extended far beyond their economic functions. They became figures in literature and folklore, representing both heroic self-sacrifice and questionable commercial morality. Stories about winter merchants who died attempting to deliver essential goods to desperate communities became legends that celebrated both commercial enterprise and community service. At the same time, stories about winter merchants who exploited community desperation for excessive profits became cautionary tales about the moral dangers of commercial activity. In the depths of medieval winter, when natural light dwindled to a few precious hours each day and cold penetrated every human shelter, communities developed daily rhythms that were entirely different from those of any other season. These were not the regular patterns of modern life, governed by clocks and schedules, but organic responses to survival necessities that shaped every moment from awakening to sleep, creating temporal structures that reflected the fundamental challenge of staying alive until spring's return. Medieval winter days began before dawn, not from any artificial schedule, but from the practical necessity of tending fires that had burned low during the night. Someone in each household, often designated in advance, had the responsibility of rising, while it was still dark, to add fuel to embers that might mean the difference between warmth and potentially fatal cold. This first task of each day required moving through the frigid air of unheated spaces to reach fuel stores, then carefully coaxing flames back to life without wasting precious combustible materials. The process of awakening a medieval household during winter was gradual and strategic. The person responsible for fire tending would warm the area around the hearth first, creating a zone of relative comfort where other family members could dress and prepare for the day's activities. Clothing during medieval winter was not simply put on, but strategically layered, with each household member adding garments in a careful sequence, designed to trap body heat while allowing enough mobility for essential tasks. Medieval winter mornings were dominated by assessment activities that had no equivalent in modern life. Household managers, typically the senior women of the family, had to evaluate food stores, fuel supplies, and the health condition of all family members to plan the day's resource allocation. How much food could be used for the morning meal? Was there adequate fuel to maintain warming fires throughout the day? Did anyone show signs of illness that might require special attention or modified work assignments? The medieval winter breakfast, when it existed at all, was typically a simple meal designed more for sustenance than satisfaction. Hot porridge or thin soup, made from whatever grains were available and warmed over the precious fire, provided calories and warmth that helped prepare bodies for the day's survival tasks. This morning meal was often the most substantial food that people would consume until evening, making its nutritional content critical for maintaining the energy needed for essential work. Medieval winter work began as soon as there was sufficient light to perform tasks safely. But the nature of that work was entirely different from agricultural or craft activities that occupied other seasons. Winter work was primarily maintenance and survival-oriented, tending fires, managing food supplies, repairing clothing and equipment, caring for animals, and performing the countless small tasks that kept households functioning under adverse conditions. The division of labor during medieval winter reflected both traditional gender roles and practical necessities that sometimes superseded social conventions. Women typically managed internal household activities, food preparation, textile work, childcare, and health management that could be performed indoors near heat sources. Men usually handled external tasks, fuel gathering, animal care, building maintenance, and security concerns that required exposure to outdoor conditions. However, when survival was at stake, these role divisions could be flexible, with family members performing whatever tasks their skills and physical condition allowed. Medieval winter textile work was one of the few productive activities that could continue throughout the cold months, and it often provided the primary occupation for women and children during long winter evenings. Spinning, weaving, sewing, and mending could be performed by firelight and actually contributed to household warmth through the physical activity involved. This work was not just practical but social, providing opportunities for conversation, storytelling, and community bonding during months when other forms of social interaction were limited. The care of animals during medieval winter required daily attention that could not be postponed regardless of weather conditions. Livestock that provided essential resources, milk, eggs, eventual meat, had to be fed, watered, and protected from cold, even when human comfort was minimal. This daily animal care created routine activities that provided structure to medieval winter days. But it also created additional resource drains on communities that were already struggling with scarcity. Medieval winter food preparation was a complex daily process that required careful planning and resource management. Meals had to be nutritious enough to sustain hard physical work and maintain body heat, but they also had to be prepared using minimal fuel and ingredients that were becoming increasingly scarce as winter progressed. The preparation of each meal required decisions about trade-offs between immediate satisfaction and long-term resource conservation. The medieval winter evening was the longest part of each day, beginning when daylight failed often as early as mid-afternoon during the deepest winter, and extending until sleep time. These long evenings had to be filled with activities that could be performed in minimal light and that contributed to family survival and community welfare. Storytelling, religious observance, craft work, and social interaction all took place around fires that provided the only light and warmth available. Medieval winter sleep patterns were entirely different from modern sleep habits, shaped by the realities of cold, darkness, and resource conservation. People often went to sleep shortly after sunset to conserve fuel that would otherwise be needed for lighting and heating. Sleep itself was often interrupted throughout the night by the need to tend fires, check on animals, or respond to weather emergencies. Winter sleep was typically communal, with multiple family members sharing beds or sleeping areas to pool body heat. The psychological rhythm of medieval winter days was profoundly affected by the constant awareness of resource depletion and the uncertainty about winter's duration. Each day brought communities closer to the exhaustion of stored food and fuel, but without reliable ways to predict when spring conditions would allow normal productivity to resume. This created daily anxiety that required mental disciplines and community support systems to manage without despair. Medieval winter weather assessment was a daily survival skill that required careful observation and interpretation of natural signs. Community members who were skilled at weather prediction became essential resources for daily planning, helping households decide whether it was safe to venture outside for essential tasks or whether severe weather required additional preparation for potential emergencies. The medical care that was essential during medieval winter months required daily attention to the health status of all community members. Winter conditions made people more susceptible to illness, while also making medical treatment more difficult and dangerous. Daily health assessment and preventive care became routine activities that were integrated into household management and community organization. Medieval winter communication between households and communities was limited by travel difficulties, but it was essential for mutual aid and resource sharing that could affect survival outcomes. Daily communication routines, even if they involved nothing more than checking on nearby neighbors, provided information networks that allowed communities to respond collectively to emergencies and to coordinate assistance for households that were facing particular hardships. The religious observances that provided spiritual and psychological support during medieval winter were often integrated into daily routines, rather than restricted to formal weekly services. Daily prayers, religious readings, and spiritual disciplines provided frameworks for understanding hardship and maintaining hope that were essential for psychological survival during the most challenging months. Medieval winter record-keeping, while often informal and unwritten, was an important daily activity that helped households track resource consumption and plan for the remainder of winter. Families needed to know how much food they had consumed, how much fuel they had used, and how their consumption rates compared to their remaining supplies and their estimates of winter's remaining duration. The end of each medieval winter day brought both relief and renewed anxiety. Relief that another day of survival had been completed successfully, but anxiety about whether resources would be adequate for the following day and all the days that would follow until spring returned. The daily rhythm of medieval winter was not just about managing immediate survival needs, but about maintaining the physical and psychological resources that would be needed for long-term endurance. Medieval winter daily rhythms also created opportunities for personal reflection and family bonding that were rare during busier seasons. The enforced slowness of winter days, the long evenings spent in close contact with family members, and the simplified activity options created time and space for deeper human connections and contemplation of life's essential meanings. These daily opportunities for reflection and relationship development often provided the psychological foundations that enabled people to endure winter's hardships with dignity and hope. There was something profoundly transformative about the way snow changed, not just the appearance of medieval landscapes, but the very acoustic environment in which communities existed. Medieval winter snow did not merely cover the familiar world, it muffled it, creating silences so profound that the normal sounds of human activity became startlingly clear, while the usual background noise of medieval life simply vanished, leaving communities wrapped in a quiet that was both peaceful and unsettling. Snow falling on a medieval village created a gradual progression from normal seasonal sounds to an almost supernatural stillness. The first light snowfall might barely be noticed acoustically, adding only a soft whisper as flakes touched the ground and settled on rooftops. But as snow accumulated, it began to absorb the sounds that normally provided audio texture to community life. The creak of wooden wheels on cart paths, the shuffle of feet on packed earth, the distant lowing of cattle or bleating of sheep from outlying fields. Heavy snow transformed medieval soundscapes so completely that people who ventured outside during or immediately after major snowfalls often described the experience as entering a different world entirely. The sharp crack of tree branches breaking under snow load could be heard from remarkable distances, echoing across landscapes where all other sounds had been dampened to whispers. Footsteps in fresh snow created sounds that seemed simultaneously louder and more isolated than normal walking. Each step clearly audible but somehow disconnected from its surroundings. Medieval buildings under snow loads developed their own acoustic personalities that revealed structural characteristics normally hidden by other sounds. The settling and creaking of wooden beams under snow weight created ongoing soundtracks that accompanied daily life throughout winter months. These sounds provided information about building conditions, which structures were bearing their snow loads successfully and which might be approaching dangerous stress levels, but they also created psychological environments that ranged from comforting to anxiety-inducing. Inside snow-covered medieval dwellings, the acoustic environment was dramatically different from other seasons. The snow on rooftops acted as insulation that not only helped retain heat, but also created acoustic barriers that made interior spaces seem more enclosed and intimate. Conversations that might normally be overheard by neighbors or passers-by were contained within individual households, creating acoustic privacy that was rare in medieval communities where buildings were typically close together and walls were thin. The silence created by snow cover also had practical implications for medieval winter survival. Community members who were skilled at interpreting sounds could use the acoustic changes created by snow to gather information that was essential for safety and resource management. The sound of ice forming on rivers could indicate changes in water accessibility. The absence of normal bird sounds might signal approaching severe weather. The cracking and settling sounds from other buildings could provide warnings about structural problems that affected community safety. Medieval winter snow silence also created opportunities for sounds that were normally masked by daily activity to become prominent and significant. The distant sound of church bells calling communities to worship could carry much farther through snow-muffled landscapes, reaching households that might not normally hear such calls clearly. The sound of human voices calling for help during emergencies could be heard across greater distances, making emergency communication more effective when weather conditions made visual contact difficult. The acoustic properties of snow-covered medieval communities also affected the social dynamics of winter life. Private conversations became more private, allowing for intimate discussions and family interactions that might be difficult during other seasons when privacy was limited. At the same time, the silence made any noise more noticeable and potentially more disturbing to neighbors, creating social pressures to minimize activities that might generate disruptive sounds. Medieval children experienced snow silence in ways that were both magical and sometimes frightening. The familiar sounds of their community life, the daily background noise that provided acoustic security and orientation could vanish entirely during heavy snow periods, leaving children in environments that felt foreign and potentially threatening. Parents had to help children understand and adapt to these acoustic changes while also using the quieter conditions as opportunities for storytelling, music, and other activities that benefited from reduced background noise. The religious significance of snow silence was recognized and incorporated into medieval spiritual practices. The profound quiet that accompanied heavy snowfalls was often interpreted as divine provision of contemplative space, opportunities for prayer and meditation that were enhanced by the removal of worldly distractions. Churches and monasteries used periods of snow silence as times for special devotional activities that took advantage of the acoustic conditions for choral music and communal prayer. Medieval winter snow also created acoustic challenges that required community adaptation and problem-solving. Normal communication methods between households or across community spaces might become ineffective when snow dampened sound transmission. Communities had to develop alternative signaling systems, visual signals, different types of calls or horn signals, or physical messaging systems that could function effectively in snow-altered acoustic environments. The hunting activities that were sometimes necessary for medieval winter survival were both helped and hindered by snow's acoustic effects. Hunters could move more quietly through snow-covered terrain, but they also had to adapt their techniques for tracking and approaching game animals whose own behavior was changed by the altered sound environment. The acoustic changes created by snow could make it easier to detect some types of animal activity, while making other hunting signs more difficult to interpret. Medieval winter storms created their own dramatic soundscapes that provided both information and emotional experiences for communities sheltering from severe weather. The sound of wind interacting with snow-laden trees, buildings, and landscape features created complex audio environments that could indicate storm intensity, wind direction, and potential dangers to structures or people. These storm sounds often provided the primary information source for assessing weather conditions. When visual observation was impossible, the gradual acoustic transition from winter silence back to spring sounds marked one of the most emotionally significant changes in the medieval seasonal cycle. The return of normal community sounds, wheels on paths, animals in fields. Construction and craft activities signaled not just improved weather, but the resumption of productive community life. The first sounds of water running from melting snow, the tentative calls of returning birds, and the gradual increase in outdoor human activity created an acoustic renaissance that marked winter's end as powerfully as any visual signs of spring's arrival. Medieval people developed sophisticated abilities to interpret the acoustic information provided by snow-covered environments. Experienced community members could distinguish between the sounds of different types of snow: wet snow that might create ice hazards, dry snow that provided better insulation, wind-blown snow that indicated continuing storm activity, and used this acoustic information for planning daily activities and assessing safety conditions. The snow silence of medieval winter also created opportunities for acoustic experiences that were impossible during other seasons. Musical activities that required careful listening, learning new songs, practicing instrumental techniques, or developing harmonies for religious music could be pursued more effectively when background noise was minimized. Storytelling traditions that depended on subtle vocal effects and audience attention benefited from the acoustic isolation that snow provided. Medieval winter snow created unique challenges for the few travelers who attempted journeys during heavy snow periods. Navigation that normally depended partly on familiar sounds, the direction of river flow, the location of human settlements, or the approach of dangerous areas became more difficult when snow altered or eliminated normal acoustic landmarks. Travelers had to develop alternative navigation techniques that compensated for the loss of audio information. The acoustic isolation created by medieval winter snow also had psychological effects that influenced community mental health. and social relationships. Some people found the profound quiet of snow-covered landscapes peaceful and conducive to reflection and rest. Others experienced snow silence as oppressive or anxiety-inducing, creating feelings of isolation and disconnection from the wider world. Communities had to provide social support for individuals who struggled with the psychological effects of extended acoustic isolation. Medieval craftspeople who worked during winter months had to adapt their techniques to snow-altered acoustic conditions. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and other artisans who normally relied partly on sound to assess their work quality, the ring of properly tempered metal, the sound of wood splitting cleanly, or the acoustic feedback from tool use had to develop. Alternative methods for evaluating their work when normal sound transmission was dampened by snow cover. The military implications of snow silence were significant for medieval communities that faced potential threats during winter months. Normal defensive strategies that depended on early acoustic warning of approaching enemies became less effective when snow dampened sound transmission. At the same time, defensive advantages could be gained from the acoustic concealment that snow provided, making it more difficult for potential attackers to coordinate their activities or assess defensive preparations. Medieval winter snow silence also affected the keeping of domestic animals in ways that required adjustment of normal husbandry practices. Animals whose behavior was normally monitored partly through sound detecting signs of distress, illness, or threats from predators required more visual attention when their normal vocalizations were muffled by snow cover. Animal caregivers had to develop alternative methods for assessing animal welfare and detecting problems that might normally be identified through acoustic cues. The end of snow silence periods during medieval winter was often as significant as their beginning, marking transitions in weather patterns that might indicate opportunities for essential activities like fuel gathering, food procurement, or travel to neighboring communities. The return of normal acoustic conditions could signal that weather was moderating enough to allow activities that had been postponed during periods of heavy snow cover. Medieval communities also learned to use periods of snow silence for activities that required concentration and coordination but were normally difficult due to background noise and distractions. Planning activities for spring planting, organizing community resources, resolving disputes, and making important family decisions could be accomplished more effectively when environmental conditions supported focused discussion and careful consideration. The acoustic legacy of medieval winter snow silence influenced cultural traditions and artistic expressions that persisted long after individual snow events had ended. Songs, stories, and religious observances that were developed during periods of snow-enhanced quiet often retained characteristics that reflected the acoustic conditions of their creation's subtle vocal techniques. Emphasis on careful listening and appreciation for sound and silence that enriched medieval cultural life throughout the year. Even in the depths of medieval winter's harshest trials, when cold penetrated every shelter, when hunger gnawed at empty stomachs, and when darkness seemed eternal, human communities constructed something that was perhaps more essential than any physical building: an architecture of hope that sustained spirits and maintained the fundamental belief that spring would return, that survival was possible, and that the human capacity for endurance could outlast winter's worst assaults. This architecture of hope was not built from stone or timber, but from traditions, rituals, shared stories, and collective practices that communities had developed over generations of surviving winter's challenges. It was constructed daily through small acts of mutual support, maintained through cultural practices that celebrated resilience, and reinforced through religious and secular traditions that placed immediate suffering within larger frameworks of meaning and eventual redemption. The foundation of medieval winter hope was rooted in historical memory and community wisdom about the cyclical nature of seasons. Elderly community members who had survived many winters served as living proof that endurance was possible, that communities could face seemingly impossible challenges and emerge intact on the other side. These elder voices provided perspective during moments of despair, reminding younger community members that previous winters had seemed equally devastating, but had eventually ended with spring's renewal. Medieval communities built hope through careful observation and celebration of subtle signs that indicated winter's gradual retreat, even when those signs were barely perceptible to casual observation. The lengthening of days after the winter solstice was marked and celebrated, even when the change was measured in minutes rather than hours. The first appearance of animal tracks in snow was noted as evidence of wildlife survival and continued life cycles. The slight warming of midday temperatures during late winter was acknowledged as progress toward eventual spring, regardless of how cold the nights remained. The religious calendar provided crucial structure for medieval winter hope, offering a series of festivals and observances that promised divine intervention, celebrated spiritual light during physical darkness, and connected immediate suffering to larger narratives of redemption and salvation. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, and other winter religious observances served as waypoints through the long, dark season, providing communities with regular opportunities to gather, to celebrate their survival thus far, and to renew their faith in eventual deliverance. Medieval winter hope was also built through the preservation and sharing of cultural treasures, stories, songs, crafts, and traditions that connected communities to their heritage and provided evidence of human creativity and resilience across generations. The stories told during long winter evenings often featured themes of endurance, triumph over adversity, and the eventual victory of good over evil that directly addressed the psychological needs of people facing their own trials. These cultural resources provided both entertainment and spiritual nourishment that sustained morale during the most difficult months. The social rituals that governed resource sharing during medieval winter created practical expressions of hope, through their implicit assumption that community survival was both possible and worthwhile. The customs that governed how food was distributed during times of scarcity, how fuel was shared among households, and how mutual aid was provided during emergencies all reflected collective commitment to the principle that everyone deserved to survive until spring returned. These sharing rituals were not just practical arrangements, but affirmations of community values and mutual obligation. Medieval communities also built hope through forward-looking activities that assumed future seasons and continued community life. Even during winter's worst moments, people engaged in planning for spring planting, preparing seeds for future crops, maintaining tools that would be needed for agricultural work, and making arrangements for activities that could only be completed after weather improved. These forward-looking activities were practical necessities, but they also served as daily affirmations of faith in the future. The craft activities that continued during medieval winter months contributed to the architecture of hope through their creation of beautiful and useful objects that enhanced community life and provided evidence of human creativity, even under adverse conditions. Textile work that produced clothing and household goods, woodworking that created tools and furniture, and artistic activities that produced decorative objects all demonstrated that human life could encompass more than mere survival, that beauty and craftsmanship remained possible even during the most challenging seasons. Medieval winter hope was reinforced through collective activities that brought communities together despite harsh conditions and resource constraints. Communal meals, even when food was scarce, provided opportunities for social connection and mutual support that strengthened community bonds. Group work activities that addressed shared survival needs created experiences of cooperation and mutual aid that demonstrated the power of collective effort. Religious services and community gatherings provided regular opportunities for people to see that they were not alone in their struggles. The maintenance of education and knowledge transmission during medieval winter months reflected community commitment to future generations and confidence that current hardships were temporary rather than permanent. Parents who taught children essential skills during long winter evenings, communities that preserved technical knowledge about craft production and agricultural techniques, and religious communities that maintained libraries and educational programs all expressed faith that their knowledge would be useful in future seasons. Medieval communities also built hope through the celebration of small victories and incremental improvements that might seem insignificant by modern standards, but represented genuine progress under winter conditions. A household that successfully preserved food stores longer than expected, a family that avoided serious illness during epidemic periods, or a community that completed winter months without losing any members were all occasions for celebration and thanksgiving that reinforced collective confidence in survival strategies. The physical improvements that communities made to buildings, tools, and infrastructure during winter months represented investments in future comfort and safety that expressed faith in continued community life. Repairs to homes and public buildings, improvements to heating and food storage systems, and preparations for better resource management in future years all demonstrated belief that current investments would pay dividends in seasons to come. Medieval winter hope was also constructed through the development of contingency plans and alternative strategies that provided psychological comfort even when they were never implemented. Communities that identified multiple potential sources of food, fuel, or shelter felt more confident about their survival prospects than those with only single options. The existence of backup plans and alternative resources provided mental acuity that helped people endure current hardships with greater peace of mind. The mentorship relationships that developed during medieval winter months created hope through the transmission of survival knowledge from experienced to inexperienced community members. Young people who learned essential skills from their elders gained confidence in their own ability to survive future challenges. The teaching process itself provided elder community members with evidence that their knowledge was valuable, and that they were making essential contributions to community welfare. Medieval communities built hope through the maintenance of communication networks that connected isolated households and provided information about survival conditions in other areas. News that other communities were successfully managing winter challenges, reports about recovery from previous disasters, and information about successful survival strategies all provided encouragement and practical guidance that strengthened local confidence and morale. The gradual emergence from medieval winter's worst challenges created opportunities for communities to assess their success in maintaining hope and to identify which hope-building strategies had been most effective. Communities that had maintained strong morale throughout winter months often found that their psychological resilience had been as important as their material resources for successful survival. The lessons learned about building and maintaining hope during crisis periods influenced community practices and cultural traditions for generations. Medieval winter hope was ultimately validated by the arrival of spring and the resumption of normal community life. But its true value lay not in its accuracy as prediction, but in its function as psychological and social resource that enabled people to persist through challenges that might otherwise have been overwhelming. The architecture of hope built during medieval winters provided blueprints for resilience that served communities throughout the year and across generations, creating cultural resources for managing adversity that were as essential as any material preparation for survival. Epilogue: The eternal spring within. And so, dear listener, as we complete our long journey through the trials and triumphs of medieval winter, as we emerge from those distant centuries where survival was never guaranteed and spring felt like a miracle rather than a certainty, we find ourselves returning to your warm, safe present with hearts full of wonder at the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and minds, enriched by the wisdom of those who endured what seemed unendurable. We have walked together through landscapes transformed by cold, through communities bound together by necessity, through households where families huddled around inadequate fires and made impossible decisions about life and death with courage that defies our modern understanding. We have witnessed the architecture of survival, not just the buildings that sheltered bodies from winter's assault, but the social structures, cultural practices, and spiritual resources that sheltered souls from despair. The medieval people whose winter we have shared were not heroes in the dramatic sense that our modern stories often celebrate. They were ordinary individuals, farmers and craftspeople, parents and children, lords and peasants who faced extraordinary challenges with whatever resources they could gather, whatever wisdom they could inherit, and whatever hope they could construct from the materials of faith, community, and stubborn human refusal to surrender to forces beyond their control. Their winter was brutal in ways that our heated, well-fed, abundantly supplied world can barely comprehend. They lived for months at a time with cold that penetrated to their bones, hunger that weakened their bodies and clouded their thoughts, darkness that seemed to swallow all possibility of light's return. They watched loved ones die from diseases we could cure with simple medications, saw children weaken from malnutrition that adequate food could have prevented, witnessed communities struggle with challenges that modern technology could solve in moments. Yet within those seemingly hopeless circumstances, they created something magnificent, a human community that refused to be broken by hardship, that found ways to share insufficient resources so that as many people as possible could survive until better times returned, that developed cultural practices and spiritual disciplines that discovered meaning and even beauty within the darkest experiences. They demonstrated that the human capacity for hope, love, creativity, and mutual support could persist under conditions that would challenge everything we consider essential for happiness and fulfillment. The lessons they offer us across the centuries are not primarily about material preparation or technical survival skills, though their practical wisdom about endurance and resourcefulness remains valuable. Their deepest teaching concerns the fundamental architecture of human resilience, how communities can be organized to support all their members during times of crisis, how individuals can maintain dignity and hope when circumstances seem hopeless, and how the bonds between people can become stronger rather than weaker when tested by shared adversity. In our modern world, where comfort is common and security is expected, we may never face the physical hardships that defined medieval winter. But we all encounter seasons, personal, professional, spiritual, or societal, when resources seem inadequate, when challenges appear overwhelming, when the future seems uncertain and the present filled with difficulty. In those moments, the wisdom of medieval winter communities offers guidance that transcends the specific circumstances of their historical period. They teach us that preparation matters, but that flexibility and adaptability matter even more. They show us that individual survival often depends on community support, and that community survival requires individual sacrifice and contribution. They demonstrate that hope is not passive optimism, but active practice, a daily choice to believe in possibilities that are not yet visible and to work toward outcomes that are not yet guaranteed. Most importantly, they remind us that human beings have always faced challenges that seemed insurmountable and have consistently found ways not just to survive, but to create meaning, beauty, and connection even within the most difficult circumstances. The stories we tell, the songs we sing, the rituals we practice, and the relationships we nurture today are part of the same continuous human tradition that sustained medieval communities through their darkest winter nights. As you settle into sleep tonight, surrounded by the warmth and abundance that medieval people could barely imagine, carry with you not guilt about your comfort, but gratitude for the generations of human struggle and achievement that made your security possible. Remember that you are part of an unbroken chain of survivors, each link forged by people who faced their own versions of medieval winter and refused to let hardship destroy their essential humanity. The spring that always returned to medieval communities was not just a change in weather, but a renewal of life, hope, and possibility that emerged from winter's apparent victory over warmth and growth. Within your own life, whatever winters you may face, that same spring exists not as external circumstance that may or may not arrive according to your timeline, but as internal resource that you carry always, the human capacity to endure, to hope, to create, and to love, even when conditions suggest that such capacities should be impossible. Sleep now, gentle soul, knowing that you are heir to centuries of human courage, inheritor of wisdom earned through generations of survival, and carrier of the eternal spring that lives within every human heart, the spring that medieval people trusted would return each year, and the spring that returns within us whenever we choose hope over despair, community over isolation, and love over fear. The medieval winter has ended, but the spring they found within themselves, the spring they created through their courage and shared with each other through their love, that spring lives on in you, ready to bloom whenever winter comes to your own world, ready to remind you that no darkness lasts forever, and no cold can finally extinguish the warmth that humans create when they refuse to surrender to circumstances beyond their control. Sweet dreams, dear traveler. May you rest in peace, knowing that you carry within yourself all the resources that sustained our ancestors through their darkest hours. And may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the simple miracles of warmth, light, abundance, and safety that surround you, gifts that become precious beyond measure. When we understand how much courage and love were required to create the world where such gifts are possible, until we meet again in the quiet hours where history whispers its secrets and ancient wisdom offers comfort to modern hearts, rest well. The medieval winter is over, spring has returned, and you, having witnessed both the depths of human hardship and the heights of human resilience, can sleep peacefully in the knowledge that whatever challenges await you, you possess the same fundamental strength that carried countless generations through their own impossible winters into the eternal spring of human hope. Good night.